I waited 50 years for this moment. When he asked me for help, I said, "You don't get to need me now." My name is Eliza May Walker, and I'm 76 years old. I've lived my entire life here in Oaksville, Louisiana, a small town where the Mississippi River bends and everyone knows your business before you do. For nearly 5 decades, I owned the only grocery store on Main Street, Walker's General Goods. Most folks around here still call me Miss Eliza, with that touch of respect reserved for women who've earned it the hard way. I'm the kind of woman who counts her words like pennies. I don't waste them. That's why people pay attention when I speak. They know if Eliza May Walker opens her mouth, something worth hearing is coming out. But there's one story I've never told. Not to my closest friends at the Baptist Women's Circle. Not to my nieces who look after me now. Not even to Pastor Wilson, who's heard every sin and sorrow this town has produced for 30 years. I've kept this wound closed up tight and hidden away, like a family Bible, too precious to be handled. Until now. You see, sometimes life gives you a second chance at justice. Not the kind they serve in courtrooms with fancy speeches and wooden gavels. The quiet kind that comes when you least expect it, when the person who broke you suddenly stands before you, broken themselves. I was 25 when it happened. Young, pretty, and foolish enough to believe in forever. I had my wedding dress hanging in the closet, white gardenias ordered for my bouquet, and my mama's silver cake server polished for the reception. The whole town was buzzing about it. The Walker girl marrying Robert Mitchell, the preacher's son with the golden voice and Sunday school smile. Everything was set for the third Saturday in May, 1974. The invitation said 3 o'clock at First Baptist. Everyone who was anyone in 3 parishes had RSVP'd. My daddy had spent nearly a year's savings to give his only daughter the wedding she deserved. But 3 o'clock came and went that Saturday. And Robert? Well, Robert never showed. What followed was the kind of humiliation that changes a person from the inside out. The kind that hardens something soft in your soul. The kind you don't recover from. You just learn to build your life around it, like a tree growing over an old fence post, swallowing the metal, but never truly healing. For 50 years, I lived with that day carved into me. I built myself into someone new, not a bride, not a wife, not a mother, but a businesswoman, respected and a little feared. I kept my head high and my heart locked. The people in town stopped mentioning his name around me. Some even forgot or pretended to. But I never forgot, not for one single day. And then last month, I heard he was back. Robert Mitchell had come home to Oaksville, alone, sick, living in a small trailer on his nephew's property out by the parish line. When Mary Louise from the pharmacy told me, I laughed. Actually laughed out loud, right there between the cold medicine and the reading glasses. 50 years I'd imagined what I'd say if I ever saw him again. 50 years of rehearsed speeches and clever comebacks that would make him feel as small as he'd made me feel. But now he was here. Really here. And suddenly, those 50 years felt like nothing more than a long breath I'd been holding. "He's asking about you, Eliza," Mary Louise said, her eyes wide with the delicious scandal of it all. "Says he wants to see you before—" She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. Before he dies. That's what she meant. I went home that afternoon and took out the small cedar box I keep in my bottom drawer. Inside was the only thing I saved from that day, a small gold locket with our initials engraved on the back. I never opened it after that Saturday. Never wore it again. Just kept it there, a reminder of the woman I refused to be, someone who could be left behind. The next morning I put on my good dress, dark green, because I always hated blue, fixed my silver hair in a neat bun, and drove my old Buick to the address Mary Louise had whispered to me. I was going to see Robert Mitchell one last time. Not for forgiveness, not for closure, but for something else entirely. Something I'd waited 50 years to deliver. And that's when everything I thought I knew about pain, about justice, about my own heart, changed forever. Spring of 1974 was unusually warm in Oaksville, Louisiana. The kind of heat that made the air thick like honey and had folks moving slow, fanning themselves on front porches while cicadas screamed from the magnolia trees. Our little town sat right where the Mississippi River made a lazy bend, close enough that during flood season we could smell the muddy water rising. I was 25 then, with chestnut hair that fell past my shoulders and enough curves to turn heads at Sunday service. Mama always said I should have been born in a bigger place where someone might have spotted me for movies. But Oaksville was home. It wasn't much. 3 churches, 2 bars, 1 decent, 1 not, a small main street with Clement's General Store, Miller's Pharmacy, and a diner called Pearl's, where the pie was always fresh, but the coffee tasted like dishwater. We lived in a white clapboard house on Magnolia Avenue, me, Mama, and Daddy. It wasn't fancy, but it had good bones, as Daddy liked to say. The porch wrapped halfway around, with a swing that creaked just right on summer evenings. Inside, the floors were worn pine that Mama polished until they gleamed. We had real furniture from Montgomery Ward that Daddy had paid for in installments when the paper mill was doing well. My daddy, James Walker, worked at the Oaksville Paper Company for 32 years. Started on the line and worked his way up to floor manager. Mama, Lucille, kept house and did alterations for half the town. They were simple people who believed in hard work, the Baptist church, and saving for a rainy day. I worked as a clerk at Miller's Pharmacy, counting pills into little amber bottles and ringing up purchases. It wasn't exciting, but it was respectable, and Mr. Miller paid fair. I'd been there since high school graduation, when college dreams faded because we just didn't have the money. But I didn't mind. I was waiting for my real life to start, the one with a husband, children, and a home of my own. And in 1973, it seemed like that life was finally beginning when Robert Mitchell started coming into the pharmacy every Tuesday, just when my shift started. Robert was the son of Pastor Mitchell over at First Baptist. He'd been away at seminary school in Atlanta and had just returned to assist his aging father with the congregation. He was 30, 5 years older than me, with sandy blonde hair that fell just right over his forehead and the kind of smile that made you feel like you were standing in a patch of sunshine. The first time he came in, he asked for cough drops. The second time, vitamin C. By the third visit, we both knew he wasn't there for medicine. "Miss Eliza," he said, leaning against the counter, "I was wondering if you might like to join me for ice cream after your shift. It's awful hot today, and Thompson's just got in a new flavor, butter pecan." I remember trying not to smile too quick, trying to channel my mama's advice about not seeming too eager. "Well, Reverend Mitchell, I suppose ice cream would be nice on a hot day like this." "Please, call me Robert," he said, and something about the way his eyes crinkled at the corners made my heart flutter like a trapped bird. That first date led to another, then another. We'd walk along Main Street after church, go for drives in his father's Oldsmobile, sit on my parents' porch swing until Daddy flicked the lights to tell him it was time to go home. By Christmas, the whole town was talking about us, wondering when he'd pop the question. The proposal came on New Year's Eve at the church social. Pastor Mitchell was giving his annual blessing for the coming year when Robert stood up, walked to the front, and asked for everyone's attention. "I'd like to start this new year by asking the most important question of my life," he said, his voice carrying through the church hall. Then he turned to me, got down on one knee right there in front of God and everybody, and pulled out a small velvet box with a modest diamond ring that I later learned had belonged to his grandmother. "Eliza May Walker, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The room went so quiet you could hear Mrs. Beaumont's hearing aid whistling 3 rows back. Everyone was watching, waiting. Women with hands pressed to their mouths, men nodding approvingly, and me feeling like I might float right up to the ceiling with happiness. "Yes," I said, my voice barely a whisper at first, then louder. "Yes." The hall erupted in applause and well wishes. Pastor Mitchell embraced me with tears in his eyes, calling me daughter for the first time. My mama cried. My daddy shook Robert's hand so hard I thought he might pull it clean off. We set the date for May 15th, far enough to plan a proper wedding, but not so far that people would talk. Because people always talked in Oaksville. That's just how small towns are. They watch, they whisper, they wait for you to make a mistake. The months that followed were a whirlwind of plans and preparations. Mama and I drove all the way to Baton Rouge to find the perfect dress, white satin with lace overlay, a sweetheart neckline, and a train that would trail beautifully down the aisle of First Baptist. We ordered invitations with silver embossing, chose flowers, white gardenias for the bouquets, pink roses for the church, picked out the cake, 3 tiers, white with buttercream frosting. My bridesmaids were my 3 closest friends since grade school, Sarah Beth Collins, Patty Lambert, and Ruth Ann Woodley. We'd spent countless sleepovers talking about our future husbands, and now I was the first to walk down the aisle. They threw me a beautiful shower at the church hall, where I received enough Pyrex and kitchen towels to outfit 3 homes. Robert's groomsmen were his brother Thomas, who drove down from Nashville, and 2 seminary friends who'd come all the way from Georgia. Everyone said what a fine-looking wedding party we'd make, how the photographs would turn out just beautiful. Our engagement announcement ran in the Oaksville Gazette with a photo of us looking young and happy and full of promise. Mama had it framed and put it on the mantel, right next to my high school graduation picture. "You're finally becoming a real lady," Mama would say, as we worked on the seating chart at the kitchen table. "The wife of a pastor. There's no higher calling for a woman in this town." And I believed it. I believed every word, every promise, every plan. I believed in Robert Mitchell with his gentle hands and his way of quoting scripture that made it sound like poetry. I believed in the future we were building together. A parsonage home filled with children, Sunday dinners after church, a lifetime of service to God and community. The whole town was invested in our wedding. Mrs. Landry, who played organ at First Baptist for 40 years, promised to perform a special arrangement of Ave Maria as I walked down the aisle. The ladies of the church quilting circle made us a wedding quilt with both our initials embroidered in the center square. Mr. Thompson from the ice cream parlor offered to create a special flavor for our reception. Robert and I went through the required premarital counseling with his father, discussing our expectations for marriage, our views on children. We both wanted at least 3, how we'd handle finances. Robert would manage the money, as was proper. Pastor Mitchell beamed with pride during these sessions, clearly pleased with his son's choice of bride. 2 weeks before the wedding, we reserved the fellowship hall for the rehearsal dinner. 1 week before, the ladies of the church decorated the sanctuary with white ribbons and greenery that would stay fresh until the ceremony. 3 days before, Mama and I did a final fitting on my dress, which hung in her closet covered in a sheet to keep it pristine. The night before the wedding, the women in my family gathered at our house for what Mama called a blessing circle. My aunts, cousins, and grandmother sat in our living room, each sharing a piece of marriage advice and saying a prayer for my future. Grandma Walker, who'd been married to my grandfather for 53 years before he passed, held my hands in her papery ones and looked me straight in the eyes. "Marriage ain't always easy, child," she said in that gravel voice of hers. "There'll be days you want to pack your bags and run. Don't you do it. You weather the storm together. That's what makes a marriage last." I nodded solemnly, but honestly, I couldn't imagine ever wanting to leave Robert. We were perfect together. Everyone said so. That night, I could barely sleep. I kept thinking about the next day, how I'd feel walking down that aisle, saying those vows, becoming Mrs. Robert Mitchell. I imagined our life together in such vivid detail. Sunday mornings at church, where I'd sit in the front pew, watching my husband preach with pride. Evenings on our porch, with children playing in the yard, growing old together in this town we both loved. When I finally drifted off around 3 in the morning, I dreamed of white gardenias and church bells, and Robert's smile as he watched me walk toward him. I woke at dawn to the sound of my mama knocking on my bedroom door. "Rise and shine, bride-to-be," she called, her voice lilting with excitement. "Today's your big day." Little did I know that just across town, in the parsonage behind First Baptist Church, Robert Mitchell was writing a note that would change everything. A note that began, "I am so sorry, but I cannot go through with this wedding." But as I stretched and smiled at the morning sunshine streaming through my window, as I whispered a prayer of thanks for this perfect day, I had no idea that by sunset I would become the most pitied woman in Oaksville, Louisiana, the pastor's son's jilted bride. And that story, the story of what happened at 3 o'clock that Saturday afternoon and all the days that followed, would define the next 50 years of my life. People in Oaksville knew me long before I became the woman left at the altar. I was Eliza May Walker, daughter of James and Lucille, a girl who grew up picking blackberries along fence rows and swimming in Miller's Creek when summer got too hot to bear. I worked at Miller's Pharmacy from the day after high school graduation. Mr. Miller had known me since I was knee-high, watched me grow up counting out pennies for penny candy at his counter. When I turned 18, he offered me the job without me even asking. "Eliza May," he said, "you've got a good head for numbers and a kind way with people. I need someone like you behind my counter." And that was that. My future decided with a handshake and a starting salary of $1.75 an hour. I was good at my job, knew every customer by name, remembered their prescriptions without looking at labels, could tell when Mrs. Patterson's arthritis was acting up just by the way she held her purse. People trusted me, confided in me. I knew who in town was expecting before their own mothers did, who was taking what for which ailment, who couldn't afford their medicine that month. And what I knew, I kept to myself. In a town like Oaksville, discretion was as valuable as gold. Before Robert Mitchell came back to town, I'd had my share of admirers. Tommy Lawrence, who worked at the paper mill with my daddy, asked me to the Founders' Day dance 3 years running. Billy Thibodeau, whose family owned the crawfish farm outside town, brought me fresh catch every Friday for a whole summer. Even Mr. Beaumont's son, who went off to college in Baton Rouge and came back a lawyer, asked me out for dinner once. But I never felt about any of them the way I felt when Robert walked into the pharmacy that Tuesday. It wasn't just that he was handsome, though Lord knows he was. Tall with those sandy blonde curls and eyes the color of the river after rain. It wasn't just his position as the pastor's son, though that certainly gave him standing in our town. It was something else. Something in the way he looked at me, like he could see past the careful shop girl to something underneath. Something I didn't even know was there. "You're different, Eliza May," he told me once as we sat on a bench by the river. "Most girls around here, they're content to just stay, to never think beyond Oaksville. But you've got dreams in your eyes." And he was right. I did have dreams, though I'd never spoken them aloud. Dreams of seeing the ocean, of living in a place where people didn't know every detail of my history, of doing something that mattered beyond filling prescriptions and making small talk. Somehow, Robert saw that in me, or at least, I thought he did. Robert himself was a man of contradictions, the perfect son on Sunday mornings, standing beside his father in the pulpit with his hair slicked back and his Bible open. But on weeknights, he'd drive us to the parish line where there was a roadhouse that served beer and played music too loud for the Baptist ladies' auxiliary to approve of. "Don't you worry about your reputation?" I asked him once as we sat in his car, listening to a band playing through open windows. He laughed, that carefree laugh that made my heart skip. "My father's the one with the calling, Eliza, not me. I'm just helping out until he retires." "You don't want to be a pastor?" He took a long sip of his beer before answering. "What I want is to live a life worth remembering. This town, these people, they're good folks, salt of the earth. But there's a whole world out there. Places where the streets don't roll up at 9 o'clock, where people talk about more than the weather, and whose daughter is getting married next." I didn't tell him then, but his words scared me a little. I'd never been outside Louisiana. The farthest I'd traveled was to Baton Rouge for my cousin's wedding. The world Robert talked about, cities with tall buildings and fancy restaurants and people who didn't know your name, it sounded exciting, but frightening too. But Robert had a way of making the scary seem possible. When he talked about us moving to New Orleans after the wedding, about him working at a big church there while I could maybe go to night school, learn something new, it didn't sound terrifying anymore. It sounded like an adventure we'd face together. His family loved me, or seemed to. Pastor Mitchell would pat my hand at Sunday dinner and tell Robert he'd found a real treasure. Mrs. Mitchell taught me how to make Robert's favorite peach cobbler, showed me the family recipes she'd copied out for me to take to my new home. His brother Thomas told embarrassing stories about Robert as a boy, and we all laughed until our sides hurt. I thought I knew him, you see. I thought I understood the man I was marrying, his dreams, his fears, the way his mind worked. We'd spend hours talking about everything, books we'd read, places we wanted to see, how many children we might have someday. I told him things I'd never told anyone, about how I sometimes felt trapped in Oaksville, about how I wondered if there was more to life than what I could see from my parents' front porch. Looking back, I can see the signs I missed, the way he'd sometimes go quiet in the middle of a conversation, his mind clearly somewhere else. The mysterious trips to Baton Rouge he took without explanation, the phone calls that would come to the parsonage late at night, calls he'd take in private, the rumors that floated through town, Robert seen drinking hard liquor at the Crossroads bar, Robert talking too friendly with Stella Landry, whose reputation wasn't the kind a pastor's son should associate with. But when you're in love, you choose what you want to see. And I chose to see the man who brought me wildflowers picked from the side of the road, who read poetry to me on Sunday afternoons, who told me I was the most beautiful girl in Louisiana with such conviction that I almost believed it. My friends tried to warn me, in their way. Ruth Ann, who'd known me since first grade, pulled me aside at my bridal shower. "Eliza, honey, are you sure about this? Robert's got a restless spirit, always has." "He loves me," I said, arranging the stack of dish towels someone had given me. "And I love him." "Love isn't always enough," she said, but I waved her off. What did Ruth Ann know about it? She was engaged to Calvin Peterson, who'd never left Oaksville in his life, and probably never would. They'd live in a little house 3 streets over from her parents, have babies that looked just like them, grow old sitting on the same porch swing they'd courted on. It was a good life, a solid life. But it wasn't what I wanted anymore. Not since Robert. The worst warning came from my daddy, just a week before the wedding. He called me out to the backyard where he was working on fixing an old chair. Daddy wasn't a man of many words, and when he did speak, it was usually practical things, the weather, the car needing oil, the roof leaking again. But that evening, as the sun set over the trees and turned the sky pink and gold, he put down his tools and looked at me straight. "Lisbeth," he said, using the name only he called me, "I want you to be sure about this marriage. Really sure." "I am, Daddy," I said, though something in his tone made my stomach tighten. Robert Mitchell is a charming young man. Got away with words, like his father. But I've heard things that concern me. "What things?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "There's talk he's been gambling over at the Crossroads, talk he owes some people money, talk that ain't fitting for a man about to start a family." "That's just talk, Daddy. People in this town love to gossip. Where there's smoke, there's usually fire, Lisbeth." He picked up his hammer again, turned it over in his weathered hands. "All I'm saying is, you can still change your mind. Ain't nobody going to think less of you for being careful with your future. But I was 25 years old and thought I knew everything. I love him, Daddy, and he loves me. Everything else will work itself out." He nodded, resignation in his eyes. "I hope you're right, baby girl. I surely do." 3 days before the wedding, Robert and I had our final dinner together at the parsonage. Mrs. Mitchell had outdone herself. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans cooked with bacon, hot rolls that melted butter on contact, and a peach cobbler for dessert. We ate until we couldn't move, laughing and talking about the wedding, about the honeymoon trip to Biloxi that Robert's parents had gifted us. After dinner, Robert walked me to my car, the night air heavy with jasmine and honeysuckle. The crickets were singing their evening song, and fireflies blinked in the darkness like earthbound stars. 3 more days, he said, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. Then you'll be Mrs. Robert Mitchell. I can hardly believe it, I said, and it was true. Sometimes it felt like I was living in a dream. Like any moment I might wake up and find myself back in my ordinary life, without the excitement and promise that Robert had brought into it. Believe it, he said, and kissed me. A kiss that felt different somehow, more urgent, more desperate. When he pulled away, there was a strange look in his eyes, a look I couldn't read then, but have replayed in my memory 1,000 times since. "What is it?" I asked. He shook his head. "Nothing. Just, I want you to remember that I do love you, Eliza May. Whatever happens, I want you to remember that." "Of course I will," I said, laughing a little at his solemnity. "And I love you too. Always will." He nodded, kissed me once more, quickly this time, and helped me into my car. "I'll see you Saturday," he said. 3 o'clock sharp. "I'll be the one in white," I teased. I drove home with the windows down, singing along to the radio, feeling like the luckiest girl in the world. I had no idea that I would never see Robert Mitchell again until 50 years later, when he would come back into my life in a way I could never have imagined. That night, as I laid out my things for the morning, my robe, my curlers, the special face cream I'd splurged on for the wedding, I thought about my future, about waking up next to Robert every morning, about the children we might have, about the life we'd build together. I thought about leaving Oaksville, about seeing new places, about becoming someone different, someone more. I never once thought about what I would do if he didn't show up. Never once considered that the happiest day of my life might become the worst. Never imagined that in less than 48 hours I would become the woman Oaksville would pity for decades to come. The woman left standing at the altar in her white dress with gardenias wilting in her hands. But that's exactly what happened. And that moment, that public humiliation, that betrayal, would define me in ways I couldn't have imagined. It would shape the next 50 years of my life, hardening me into someone I never intended to become. Until he came back. Until I had to face not just him, but the woman I'd become because of him. And now, 50 years later, here I am, driving my old Buick down a dusty road to a trailer on the outskirts of town, about to look in the face of the man who broke my heart and changed my life forever. Not for forgiveness, not for closure, but for something else entirely, something I've waited half a century to deliver. The morning of May 15th, 1974 dawned bright and clear in Oaksville, Louisiana, like God himself had ordered up perfect weather for my wedding day. I woke to the sound of birds outside my window and my mother's gentle knock on the door. "Eliza May, time to get up. Today's the big day." I'd barely slept a wink, too excited about what lay ahead. The dress hanging on my closet door, the flowers being delivered to the church, the cake waiting at the fellowship hall, all those months of planning, all those dreams about to come true. I stretched and smiled, whispering a little prayer of thanks. The house was already bustling with activity when I went downstairs. My aunts had arrived early to help, and the kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and the cinnamon rolls Aunt Beatrice always made for special occasions. Mama was directing everyone like a general, checking things off her list, making sure nothing was forgotten. "The hairdresser will be here at 10, she reminded me, pouring me a cup of coffee. "Your daddy's gone to pick up your grandmother from the nursing home. Ruth Ann and the girls will be here by 11 to help you dress." I nodded, too nervous to eat much, just nibbling at a cinnamon roll and sipping my coffee. The butterflies in my stomach were dancing something fierce, but it was a good kind of nervous. The kind that comes with knowing your whole life is about to change for the better. By noon, the house was filled with women, my bridesmaids, my cousins, neighbors who dropped by to offer help and steal a glimpse of the bride before the ceremony. My hair was set in soft curls, my nails painted a pale pink. Ruth Ann's mother, who'd been a beautician before she retired, was doing everyone's makeup. Not too much now, Mama instructed. Eliza's got natural beauty, just a little enhancement. I sat at the vanity in my bedroom, surrounded by the women who'd known me all my life, watching as my face was transformed with a light dusting of powder, a touch of mascara, a dab of pink lipstick. Outside, I could hear cars arriving, my daddy's deep voice greeting people, the house filling with laughter and excited chatter. At 1 o'clock, it was time to put on the dress. My bridesmaids helped ease it over my head, careful not to muss my hair. The satin felt cool against my skin as they fastened the tiny pearl buttons up my back. The dress fit perfectly. Mama and I had gone for the final fitting just days before. When I turned to look in the full-length mirror, I hardly recognized myself. Gone was Eliza May Walker, the pharmacy clerk. In her place stood a bride, radiant in white satin and lace, ready to begin her life as Mrs. Robert Mitchell. "Oh, Eliza," Mama whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "You're the most beautiful bride I've ever seen." The bridesmaids all agreed, their voices a chorus of approval and affection. They were beautiful too, in their pale pink dresses with bouquets of baby's breath and roses. Everything was perfect, just as I dreamed it would be. At 2 o'clock, the photographer arrived to take pictures in the house before we left for the church. Daddy came upstairs to see me for the first time in my wedding dress. He stood in the doorway, his weathered face solemn, his Sunday suit a little tight around the collar. "Lisbeth," he said softly, using the name only he called me. "You look just like an angel." I went to him, careful not to wrinkle my dress, and kissed his cheek. "Thank you, Daddy." He cleared his throat, clearly emotional. "I got something for you, a little wedding gift." From his pocket, he pulled a small velvet box. Inside was a delicate gold chain with a tiny cross pendant. "It was your grandma's," he explained. "She wore it on her wedding day. Wanted you to have it." My bridesmaids helped me fasten it around my neck, the small cross resting just at the hollow of my throat. It was perfect, simple, meaningful, a connection to the generations of women in my family who had stood where I was standing now. At 2:30, it was time to leave for the church. The white Cadillac that Daddy had borrowed from Uncle James was waiting outside, decorated with white ribbons and flowers. The neighbors had come out on their porches to wave and call good wishes as I carefully made my way down the front steps, Daddy holding my arm to steady me. The drive to First Baptist was short, just 3 blocks down Main Street, past Miller's Pharmacy where I worked, past Thompson's ice cream parlor where Robert and I had our first date, past the post office and the courthouse square. People on the sidewalk stopped to watch the wedding car pass, smiling and pointing. I felt like a princess in a fairy tale, on my way to meet my prince. We arrived at the church at 2:45. The bridesmaids were already there, having gone ahead in another car. They waited for me at the side entrance, away from the eyes of the guests who were still arriving at the front. Mama fussed with my veil one last time, straightened the satin bow at the back of my dress, handed me my bouquet of white gardenias, my favorite flowers, their sweet scent filling the small anteroom where we waited. "Now remember," she instructed, "walk slow, count to 5 between steps, just like we practiced, and smile. This is the happiest day of your life." I nodded, too choked with emotion to speak. Through the door, I could hear the organ playing, Mrs. Landry warming up with Bach as the guests were seated. I peeked through the small window and saw the church was packed. It seemed like all of Oaksville had turned out to see Robert Mitchell marry Eliza May Walker. At 5 minutes to 3, Pastor Thomas, Robert's uncle who'd come from Nashville to perform the ceremony, poked his head in the door. His expression was strange, tight, worried. "Mrs. Walker, could I speak with you a moment?" he asked my mother. Mama frowned but nodded, following him out into the hallway. I didn't think much of it at first, probably some last-minute detail about the ceremony. But then I heard my mother's voice rise, though I couldn't make out the words. Something was wrong. The bridesmaids exchanged glances. Ruth Ann squeezed my hand. Probably just wedding day jitters, she said, but her voice didn't sound convinced. The door opened again, and Mama came back in. Her face was white as a sheet, her hands trembling. "Mama?" I asked, my heart suddenly pounding. "What is it? What's wrong?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with a terrible sadness. "Oh, Eliza, honey." And that's when I knew. Something had happened to Robert. Was he hurt? In an accident? My mind raced with horrible possibilities. "Tell me," I demanded, my voice stronger than I felt. "Is Robert all right?" Mama took a deep breath. "Robert's fine, honey, but he's not here." I didn't understand. "Not here? What do you mean, not here? The ceremony starts in 5 minutes. He left a note with his father," Mama said, her voice breaking. "He's not coming, Eliza. He's gone." The world tilted sideways. I heard gasps from my bridesmaids, saw Ruth Ann's hand fly to her mouth, felt someone grip my arm to steady me. But all I could focus on was my mother's face, her eyes pleading with me to understand something that was incomprehensible. What are you talking about? This is our wedding day. He has to be here." Pastor Thomas appeared in the doorway again, his face grim. In his hand was an envelope. "Miss Walker, I'm so sorry. My nephew. He left this for you." I took the envelope, my fingers numb. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. I recognized Robert's handwriting immediately. The same handwriting that had signed all those love letters, all those promises. "Eliza, I'm sorry. I can't go through with this. Please forgive me someday. Robert." That was it. 7 words to end what was supposed to be forever. 7 words to shatter every dream, every plan, every hope I'd built my life around. I read it once, twice, 3 times, waiting for the words to change, to make sense. They didn't. The room was silent, everyone watching me, waiting for my reaction. Outside, the organ was still playing, the guests still sitting in their pews, unaware that there would be no wedding today. "This is a mistake," I said finally, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "He wouldn't do this. Not Robert. Not to me." "Honey," Mama said gently, reaching for me. "His father found the note this morning. They've been looking for him all day. His car is gone. He took some clothes. Left town, it seems." The truth of it hit me like a physical blow. Robert hadn't been in an accident. He wasn't hurt or in trouble. He had chosen to leave. He had decided on our wedding day that he didn't want me after all. "No," I said, backing away from my mother's outstretched hands. "No, no, no." The room started to spin. Black spots danced in front of my eyes. I heard Ruth Ann say, "Catch her," and felt strong arms around me as my knees gave way. Then darkness. When I came to, I was lying on the sofa in Pastor Mitchell's study. Someone had removed my veil, loosened the buttons at the back of my dress. Mama was dabbing my forehead with a cool cloth, Ruth Ann fanning me with a church bulletin. The other bridesmaids stood around, their faces a mix of shock, pity, and something else. Relief that it wasn't them, perhaps. Relief that they weren't the one who'd been left at the altar. "What happened?" I asked, though I already knew. It hadn't been a nightmare after all. "You fainted, honey," Mama said, still dabbing at my face. "Just for a minute." "The guests," I whispered. "All those people." "Your father's telling them now," Mama said. "Pastor Mitchell is helping him. They're sending everyone home." I imagined my father standing in front of 300 people, friends, family, neighbors, practically the entire town of Oaksville, announcing that there would be no wedding today, that the groom had run off, leaving his bride waiting in her white dress. The humiliation of it burned through me like fire. "I can't face them," I said, the panic rising in my throat. "I can't go out there. I can't." "You don't have to, Eliza," Ruth Ann assured me, squeezing my hand. "We'll take you home the back way. Nobody has to see you." That's what we did. While Daddy and Pastor Mitchell dealt with the shocked guests, my bridesmaids helped me through the back door of the church and into Sarah Beth's car. Ruth Ann got in the back with me, holding my hand as I sat in stunned silence, my wedding dress bunched around me, my bouquet forgotten on the floor of Pastor Mitchell's study. We drove the long way around town, avoiding Main Street with its curious onlookers. When we got to my house, Ruth Ann and Sarah Beth helped me inside, up to my bedroom, away from the prying eyes of the neighbors who had already started to gather, drawn by the news that was spreading through Oaksville like wildfire. Mama arrived a little while later, her face streaked with tears. She'd brought my bouquet, retrieved from the church, though the gardenias were already starting to wilt in the Louisiana heat. She set it on my dresser without a word, then helped me out of the wedding dress, hanging it carefully in the closet as if it might still be needed someday. I sat on the edge of my bed in my slip, staring at nothing, feeling nothing. The shock had numbed me, turned me to stone. Mama brought me a glass of sweet tea with a little something extra added, probably from the bourbon Daddy kept for medicinal purposes. I drank it without tasting it. Why? I asked, finally, the question that had been echoing in my mind since I read that note. Why would he do this? Mama shook her head. I don't know, baby. Men. Sometimes they get scared. Cold feet, they call it. This isn't cold feet, Mama. This is cruel. This is... I couldn't find words strong enough to describe what Robert had done. I know, honey. I know. She sat beside me, put her arm around my shoulders. We don't have to talk about it now. You just rest. Tomorrow will be soon enough to figure things out. But I knew there was nothing to figure out. Robert was gone. He'd left me at the altar, left me to face 300 guests in my white dress with no groom in sight, left me to bear the whispers, the pitying glances, the inevitable gossip that would follow me through Oaksville for years to come. That night, I lay in bed fully clothed, unable to sleep, unable to cry, just staring at the ceiling as the events of the day played over and over in my mind. The beautiful morning, the excitement of getting ready, the pride in my father's eyes when he saw me in my dress. And then the moment it all fell apart. He's not coming, Eliza. He's gone. The house was quiet. Mama had finally gone to bed after sitting with me for hours. Daddy was still up. I could hear him moving around downstairs, probably having a drink, probably blaming himself for not seeing this coming, for not protecting his only daughter from this kind of pain. Around midnight, there was a soft knock on my bedroom door. It was Ruth Ann. She'd told her husband she was staying with me tonight, wouldn't leave me alone in my grief. You awake? She whispered, coming to sit on the edge of my bed. I nodded in the darkness. Can't sleep. I brought you something. She handed me a small paper bag. Inside was a pint of bourbon, not the medicinal kind, but the good stuff. Thought you might need it. I almost smiled. Ruth Ann had been my best friend since first grade. She knew me better than anyone. Knew that right now I didn't need platitudes or reassurances. I needed something to dull the edge of this pain. We passed the bottle back and forth, not talking much at first, just sitting in the darkness of my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of my wedding day. The dress in the closet, the wilting bouquet, the wedding gifts that would have to be returned. He's a coward, Ruth Ann said finally, her voice tight with anger. A goddamn coward. I took another sip of bourbon, feeling it burn all the way down. Why didn't he just tell me? If he was having doubts, why didn't he say something before today? Before everything was ready? Before everyone knew? Because he's a coward, she repeated, and you're better off without him, Eliza. I know it doesn't feel like it now, but you are. I wasn't sure I believed her. At that moment, I couldn't imagine ever feeling better, ever recovering from this kind of humiliation, this kind of heartbreak. What am I going to do? I asked, my voice small in the darkness. How am I going to face everyone? Ruth Ann squeezed my hand. With your head held high, that's how. You didn't do anything wrong, Eliza. You have nothing to be ashamed of. But we both knew that wasn't how it worked in a town like Oaksville. It didn't matter that I wasn't at fault. I would still be the woman who was left at the altar, the cautionary tale mothers would tell their daughters, the subject of gossip at the beauty parlor and the grocery store for years to come. That night was the first of many where sleep eluded me. I'd lie awake, replaying every conversation, every moment with Robert, looking for clues I might have missed, warnings I should have heeded. Had there been signs? Had I been blind to his doubts, his restlessness? Or had he hidden them from me, played the devoted fiancé while planning his escape all along? I didn't know. And as the days turned into weeks, I realized I might never know. Robert was gone, not just from the church that Saturday, but from Oaksville completely. He didn't return to the parsonage, didn't call, didn't write. Pastor Mitchell, red-faced with shame, told my father that Robert had contacted him from New Orleans, said he was sorting some things out. But there was no apology, no explanation, no effort to make amends for what he'd done. And I was left behind, surrounded by the pieces of a future that had shattered before it even began. Left to pick them up one by one and try to build something new. Something I hadn't planned for, something I'd never wanted. Left at the altar in my white dress with gardenias wilting in my hands, a note with 7 words, and 300 witnesses to my humiliation. That day changed me in ways I wouldn't fully understand for years to come. The Eliza May who woke up that morning, hopeful, trusting, heart wide open, died somewhere between "he's not coming" and that final sip of bourbon in the darkness with Ruth Ann. In her place grew someone harder, someone guarded, someone who would never, ever allow herself to be that vulnerable again. And for 50 years, that's who I remained. Until the day Robert Mitchell came back to Oaksville, and everything changed again. After that day in the church, Oaksville changed for me. The town I'd known and loved all my life became a prison of whispers and pitying glances. I couldn't walk down Main Street without feeling the weight of those stairs, couldn't shop at Thompson's Grocery without overhearing hushed conversations that stopped the minute I came near. For the first week after the wedding, that wasn't. I didn't leave the house at all. Mama brought me soup and toast on a tray, like I was sick with something catching. Daddy paced the floor downstairs, his heavy footsteps a constant reminder of his helpless rage. The phone rang off the hook, well-meaning friends and nosy neighbors alike, all wanting to know if I was all right when we all knew I wouldn't be for a long time. It was Ruth Ann who finally dragged me out of bed on the 8th day. She marched into my room, threw open the curtains, and set a cup of coffee so strong it could have walked on its own right on my nightstand. "That's enough, Eliza May," she announced, hands on her hips. "You can't hide forever." "I'm not hiding," I mumbled, pulling the sheet over my head. "I'm dying of humiliation. There's a difference." She yanked the sheet away. "Well, you smell like you're dying of something. Get up, take a shower, put on some clothes that aren't your nightgown. You're coming with me to Miller's." The thought of going to the pharmacy, of facing Mr. Miller and the customers who'd all been at the church that day, made my stomach turn. "I can't, Ruth Ann. I just can't." "You can and you will," she said, pulling clothes from my closet, a simple yellow sundress I hadn't worn in months. "Because if you don't go back now, it'll just get harder. And I won't let Robert Mitchell take your life from you along with everything else." There was something in her voice, a fierceness, a determination, that got through to me when nothing else had. She was right. If I didn't face the town now, I never would. And hadn't Robert already taken enough? So I got up, showered, washed my hair, and let Ruth Ann blow it dry, even put on a touch of lipstick. The face in the mirror was thinner, paler than it had been just days before, with shadows under the eyes that hadn't been there on my wedding day. But it was still me, still Eliza May Walker. The walk to Miller's pharmacy was the longest 3 blocks of my life. I felt like everyone on the street was staring, though Ruth Ann insisted they weren't. My legs shook so badly by the time we reached the corner of Main and Oak that I nearly turned back. But Ruth Ann looped her arm firmly through mine and practically dragged me the rest of the way. Mr. Miller was behind the counter when we walked in, counting pills into a bottle with the careful precision that had always been his trademark. When he looked up and saw me, his bushy eyebrows shot up in surprise, then settled into something like relief. "Eliza May," he said, his voice gentle. "It's good to see you, girl. Real good." I managed a weak smile, clutching my purse so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Hello, Mr. Miller." "Your counter's been awful lonely without you," he continued, nodding toward the register where I'd worked for 7 years. "Mabel Tompkins has been filling in, but between you and me, her arithmetic isn't what it used to be." It was his way of telling me I still had a job, that the place I'd carved out for myself in this town was still mine if I wanted it. The kindness of it nearly broke me. "Thank you," I whispered. I'm not sure when I'll be ready to come back." "Whenever you are," he said simply. "Your spot's waiting." That first outing nearly drained me completely. By the time Ruth Ann walked me home, I was exhausted, as if I'd run miles instead of just walking a few blocks. But I'd done it. I'd faced the town, or at least a small corner of it, and survived. The next day, I went a little further, to Thompson's grocery. The day after that, to the post office. Each step was hard, each public appearance a test of will. Some people were kind, like Mr. Miller, others awkward, not knowing what to say. And some, I could tell, were almost enjoying the drama of it all. The tragic tale of Eliza May Walker, left at the altar by the pastor's son. It was hardest at church. First Baptist had been my spiritual home since I was a child, but now it was also the scene of my greatest humiliation. The first Sunday after the wedding, I couldn't bring myself to go. The second Sunday, Mama went without me, came back with tight lips and red eyes. It wasn't until the third Sunday that I found the courage, and only then, because Daddy said, "If we don't go back now, we might as well find another church. And I'm not about to let Robert Mitchell chase us out of our own place of worship." So we went, the three of us in our Sunday best, walking in with heads held high while the congregation tried to pretend they weren't staring. Pastor Mitchell wasn't in the pulpit that day. "Visiting a sister church," the deacon announced, though everyone knew that was a polite fiction. He couldn't face me, couldn't face the town that had witnessed his son's cowardice. Weeks turned into months. Summer faded into fall. Fall chilled into winter. I went back to work at Miller's Pharmacy, counting pills, running the register, making small talk with customers who gradually stopped looking at me with pity in their eyes. I ate dinner with my parents each night, helped Mama with the dishes, listened to the radio, went to bed early. On the surface, I was functioning, but inside, something had changed. Something fundamental. I'd built walls around my heart, thick as the levees that kept the Mississippi at bay during flood season. I was polite, but distant, pleasant, but reserved. The old Eliza, the one who laughed easily, who dreamed of love and marriage and children, was gone. In her place was someone harder, colder, more careful. Men still came around, of course. Tommy Lawrence still asked me to the Founders' Day dance. Billy Thibodeau still brought crawfish on Fridays. Even Mr. Beaumont's son, the lawyer from Baton Rouge, came calling again. But I turned them all away, gently but firmly. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, not in this lifetime. "You can't close yourself off forever," Mama said one night as we snapped beans at the kitchen table. "Not every man is Robert Mitchell." "I know that," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "I'm just not interested in finding out the hard way which ones are." She sighed, her hands never stopping their rhythmic motion. "You're young, Eliza, too young to give up on love." But I had given up on it, or maybe it had given up on me. Either way, romance was no longer part of my plan. Instead, I focused on work, on building something for myself. When Mr. Miller mentioned he was thinking of expanding the pharmacy, adding a small lunch counter to compete with the diner down the street, I volunteered to manage it. Surprised but pleased, he gave me the responsibility, and I threw myself into it with a determination that surprised even me. The lunch counter was a success. I had a knack for business that I'd never known about, an eye for what would sell and what wouldn't. Soon I was ordering supplies, scheduling staff, keeping the books. Mr. Miller gave me a raise, then another. For the first time, I was making real money, not just a clerk's salary, but enough to start saving. "You should think about opening your own place someday," Mr. Miller said one afternoon as we were closing up. "You've got a head for business, Eliza, better than most men I know." The idea took root. My own place, not dependent on anyone else, not vulnerable to anyone else's whims or weaknesses. A business of my own, built with my own hands, my own sweat. Something that couldn't be taken away by a man's cowardice or a town's pity. I started saving every penny, lived at home with my parents, even as my friends married, and moved into homes of their own. Cut my own hair instead of going to the beauty parlor. Made my own clothes instead of buying new ones. Every dollar went into a savings account at Oaksville Bank, not the same branch where Robert's father banked, but the one across town, where nobody knew me or my story. In 1977, 3 years after the wedding that wasn't, my daddy had a heart attack. One minute he was fixing the back porch step. The next he was on the ground, clutching his chest. The ambulance came, but it was too late. James Walker was gone at 58 years old, leaving Mama and me alone in the white clapboard house on Magnolia Avenue. Grief hit me like a physical force, different from the pain of Robert's betrayal, but no less intense. Daddy had been my rock, the one constant in my life. He'd stood by me through the worst days after the wedding, had faced down the town's gossip with a fierce pride that dared anyone to pity his daughter. And now he was gone, just like that, without warning or goodbye. The funeral was held at First Baptist, the same church where I was supposed to have been married. Pastor Mitchell performed the service, the first time I'd seen him face to face since that day. He'd aged a decade in 3 years, his hair gone completely white, his shoulders stooped as if under an invisible weight. When he offered his condolences after the service, his eyes couldn't quite meet mine. "Your father was a good man," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "One of the best I've known." "Yes," I replied, my voice steady despite the grief threatening to overwhelm me. He was. There was so much unsaid between us, so many words that would never be spoken. In another life, this man would have been my father-in-law. We would have shared Sunday dinners, celebrated holidays together, perhaps even watched grandchildren grow. Instead, we were strangers connected by a painful history, a betrayal that neither of us could forget or forgive. After Daddy died, everything changed again. Mama wasn't equipped to live alone. She'd gone straight from her father's house to her husband's, had never paid a bill or balanced a checkbook in her life. So I stayed, taking over the financial responsibilities, making sure the mortgage got paid, the lights stayed on, the roof got fixed when it leaked. But I also kept working, kept saving. My dream of my own business hadn't died with Daddy, had only grown stronger. Now I was saving for both of us, for a future where Mama and I wouldn't have to depend on anyone's charity or goodwill. In 1979, an opportunity arose. Thompson's grocery store, the same one where Robert had taken me for ice cream on our first date, was up for sale. Old man Thompson was retiring, moving to Florida to live with his daughter. He wanted the store to stay in local hands, someone who knew the town and its needs. "You should buy it," Ruth Ann said when I told her about it. She was married to Calvin Peterson now, with 2 kids and a third on the way. We didn't see each other as much as we used to, but our friendship had endured. "You've been saving for something like this, and Lord knows you could run that place better than Thompson ever did." The idea was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Me owning Thompson's? The very place where my romance with Robert had begun? It seemed too poetic, too fraught with painful memories. But it was also perfect. A central location, an established clientele, a business model I understood. I went to the bank, the one across town, and talked to the manager about a loan. To my surprise, he was receptive. My years of saving had given me a substantial down payment, and my reputation as a hard worker and smart businesswoman had spread beyond Miller's Pharmacy. The bank was willing to finance the rest. When I told Mama my plan, she was skeptical. A grocery store? That's man's work. That's man's work, Eliza. All that heavy lifting, dealing with suppliers. It's not ladylike. Ladylike doesn't pay the bills, Mama, I replied, my mind made up. And besides, I'm not exactly marriage material anymore, am I? Might as well put my energy into something useful. She flinched at that, at the bitterness that still edged my voice when I talked about marriage. 5 years had passed since Robert left me at the altar, but the wound was still there, still raw when touched. In the end, Mama's objections didn't matter. I bought Thompson's Grocery, renamed it Walker's General Store, and threw myself into making it a success. I hired a local boy, Tommy Lawrence's younger brother, to help with the heavy lifting. Redecorated the interior, expanded the produce section, added a small selection of household goods that had previously only been available at the hardware store 2 towns over. The first year was hard, 16-hour days, constant worry about money, the learning curve of being my own boss. But slowly, steadily, the store began to thrive. People came not just from Oaksville, but from neighboring towns, drawn by our fair prices and fresh produce. I reinvested the profits, expanding again, hiring more help. Mama even started coming in a few days a week, running the register while I dealt with suppliers or did the books. And somewhere along the way, I became Miss Eliza, not the jilted bride, not the pitiful old maid, but a respected businesswoman, a pillar of the community. People came to me for advice, for small loans to tide them over until payday, for help with reading official letters or filling out forms. I was strict but fair, demanding but generous when it counted. The walls around my heart didn't come down, though. They only grew higher, stronger. I dated occasionally, when some persistent man wore down my resistance enough for a dinner or a movie. But I never let anyone close, never gave anyone the chance to hurt me the way Robert had. When men got too interested, started talking about the future, about settling down, I ended things quickly and cleanly. "You're going to end up alone," Ruth Ann warned me once, after I'd broken things off with the high school principal, a kind widower who'd made the mistake of mentioning marriage after our 3rd date. "Better alone than betrayed," I replied, and meant it. The years passed. The 70s gave way to the 80s, the 80s to the 90s. Oaksville changed. Old businesses closed, new ones opened. The paper mill where Daddy had worked shut down, leaving many families struggling. The highway was rerouted, bringing less traffic through town, but making it quieter, more peaceful. People died, babies were born, life went on, and I grew older. The chestnut hair that Robert had loved to touch turned gray, then white. The curves that had once turned heads at Sunday service softened, spread. Lines appeared around my eyes, my mouth, but I didn't mind. Each gray hair, each wrinkle was a badge of survival, proof that I'd endured. Mama passed in 92, peacefully in her sleep. I sold the house on Magnolia Avenue, too big for just me, too full of memories, and bought a smaller place closer to the store. Converted the upstairs into an apartment where I could live, making my commute as simple as walking down a flight of stairs. Walker's General Store continued to thrive, even as big supermarket chains started appearing in neighboring towns. People remained loyal to me because I'd been loyal to them, extending credit when times were tough, delivering groceries to the elderly who couldn't make it in, knowing everyone's names and stories and needs. But at night, alone in my apartment, I sometimes wondered about the road not taken. What if Robert had shown up that day? What if we'd married, moved to New Orleans as planned, had children? Would I have been happier? Or would his restless spirit, as Ruth Ann had called it, have brought me a different kind of pain, a slower, more insidious heartbreak? I never knew what happened to him after he left Oaksville. Pastor Mitchell retired in the early 80s, moved to Nashville to be near his other son. The new pastor, a young man from Baton Rouge, knew nothing of the scandal that had rocked the church years before his arrival. Robert Mitchell became a ghost, a cautionary tale, a name that people eventually stopped mentioning in my presence. Until last month, when Mary Louise Watson, who'd taken over Miller's pharmacy after old Mr. Miller passed, came into my store with news that stopped my heart cold. "Did you hear? Robert Mitchell is back in town," she said, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of delivering such a bombshell. "Staying out at his nephew's place, that little trailer on the parish line. Heard he's sick, real sick." I froze, a can of green beans suspended halfway to the shelf I'd been stocking. Robert, back in Oaksville, after 50 years. "Is that so?" I managed to say, my voice remarkably steady considering the earthquake happening inside me. "Well, I hope he gets better soon." Mary Louise looked disappointed by my calm reaction. She'd clearly expected more drama, more emotion. "They say it's cancer, terminal. Probably came back to, make peace before the end." Make peace. The words echoed in my mind as Mary Louise moved on to other gossip, other news. Make peace. After 50 years of silence, of absence, did Robert Mitchell think he could just waltz back into town and make peace? Did he expect forgiveness? Absolution? That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my apartment, a restlessness in my bones that I hadn't felt in decades. Robert was here, in Oaksville, dying if Mary Louise was to be believed. And suddenly, all the emotions I thought I'd buried, the hurt, the rage, the humiliation, came flooding back as fresh as if it had happened yesterday, not half a century ago. I stood at my window, looking out at the quiet streets of Oaksville, at the town that had witnessed both my greatest pain and my greatest triumph. Somewhere out there, by the parish line, in a small trailer, lay the man who had changed the course of my life with a 7-word note and an act of cowardice. And I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that I was going to see him. Not for his peace, but for mine. Not for forgiveness, but for reckoning. After 50 years of wondering, of questions without answers, I was finally going to look Robert Mitchell in the face and ask him why. The decision made, I went to bed and slept more soundly than I had in years. In the morning, I woke early, dressed with care, a dark green dress, simple but elegant, my silver hair pinned in its usual neat bun, and got in my car. The old Buick started with a grumble, as if protesting this journey, but I was determined. It was time to face the ghost that had haunted me for 50 years. Time to look my past in the eye and perhaps finally lay it to rest. The road to Robert Mitchell's nephew's trailer seemed longer than it should have. My old Buick rattled down the parish road, past fields where cotton once grew and now strip malls sprawled. 50 years changes a landscape just like it changes a person. Trees grow, buildings rise and fall, new roads cut through old memories. And people, well, we weather too, don't we? I dressed with care that morning. The dark green dress wasn't fancy, but it was dignified. I'd applied a touch of lipstick, pinned my silver hair neatly. Not for him, I told myself. For me. Because when you face the ghost that's haunted you for half a century, you want to look like you've done just fine without him. The trailer sat at the end of a gravel drive, small and weathered, with a wooden ramp built hastily over the front steps, the kind you build when someone can't manage stairs anymore. A pickup truck was parked alongside, mud-splattered and well-used, not the sort of vehicle I'd ever pictured Robert Mitchell owning. But then, the Robert I knew wore pressed shirts and shined shoes and drove his daddy's Oldsmobile with one hand on the wheel, the other arm around my shoulders. I sat in my car for a long moment, engine off, hands still gripping the steering wheel. What was I doing here? What did I hope to accomplish? Closure? Justice? Or was it simple curiosity, the need to know why after all these years? "You don't have to do this," I said aloud to my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at me, lined face, gray hair, eyes that had seen too much, nodded in silent agreement. But my hand was already reaching for the door handle. The gravel crunched under my sensible shoes as I made my way to the trailer's door. A wind chime made from beer caps and fishing lures clinked softly in the breeze. Not exactly the elegant parsonage where Robert had grown up, with its polished banisters and lace curtains. I knocked, 3 sharp raps that seemed to echo in the quiet morning air. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard shuffling, slow and uneven, and the door creaked open. The man who stood there, or rather, leaned there in the doorframe, was both familiar and a stranger. Thin to the point of gauntness, with wispy white hair where golden waves had once been. The handsome face that had charmed half the girls in Oaksville was now sunken, the skin sallow and spotted with age. But the eyes, those were the same. Faded now, clouded with time and illness, but still that distinctive shade somewhere between blue and gray that had once made my heart race. For a moment we just stared at each other. I wondered if he recognized me as easily as I had him. I'd aged too, of course, but not with the desperate ravaging that illness brings. "Eliza May?" he finally said, his voice a rasp where it had once been smooth as honey in sweet tea. "Is that really you?" I straightened my spine, lifted my chin slightly. "It's me, Robert." He clutched the doorframe as if he might fall without its support. "My God," he whispered. "You came. You heard I was in town." It wasn't a question. He nodded, then seemed to remember his manners. "Please, won't you come in? It's not much, but—" "Thank you," I said stiffly, and followed him inside. The trailer was small but neat. Someone had been keeping it clean, his nephew's wife most likely. There was a hospital bed set up in what should have been the living room, with a side table cluttered with pill bottles, a water pitcher, tissues. A worn recliner sat beside it, angled toward a small television. The walls were bare except for a single photograph, an older couple I didn't recognize, probably Robert and his wife in happier days. He shuffled back to the bed, his movements painful to watch, and eased himself down onto the edge. "Please," he gestured to the recliner. "Sit. I can't believe you're really here." I sat, my purse clutched in my lap like armor. Up close, I could see just how ill he was. "Cancer," Mary Louise had said. His pajamas hung on his frame, and his hands, those hands that had once held mine so tenderly, were mottled with age spots, the veins prominent beneath tissue-thin skin. "How did you find me?" he asked. "Oaksville is still a small town, Robert. Word gets around." He smiled faintly. "Some things never change." "Some things do," I countered, unable to keep the edge from my voice. He nodded, accepting the blow. "Yes, they surely do." He looked down at his hands, then back at me. "You look good, Eliza. Real good. Life's been kind to you." I almost laughed at that. Kind? Was that what he called being left at the altar? Being turned into the town's cautionary tale? Having to rebuild a life from the ashes of public humiliation? "I made my own kindness," I said evenly. "Built my own life." "I heard. Walker's General Store. They say it's the best shop in 3 parishes." So he'd been asking about me. The thought stirred something I couldn't quite name. It does well enough. An awkward silence fell between us, 50 years of unspoken words hanging in the air. Through the thin walls of the trailer, I could hear a mockingbird singing outside, the same melody repeating over and over, like it couldn't quite remember what came next. "Why did you want to see me, Robert?" I finally asked, getting to the point. He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze steady despite his frail state. "I'm dying, Eliza." "So I heard. Pancreatic cancer, spread to the liver. Doctors gave me 3 months, maybe 4 if I'm lucky." He said it matter-of-factly, like he was discussing the weather. "Won't make it to Christmas." I didn't know what to say to that. Should I offer sympathy to the man who'd ruined my life? Or acknowledge that some part of me, a small, shameful part I didn't like to admit existed, felt a cold satisfaction that he was suffering? "I'm sorry," I said finally, "because my mama raised me to be polite, even to those who didn't deserve it." He shook his head. "Don't be. I've lived my life. made my choices. Now I'm paying for some of them. He paused, took a sip from a glass of water on the bedside table, his hand trembling slightly. But I couldn't go without seeing you one more time, without trying to explain. Explain? The word came out sharper than I intended. After 50 years, you think you can explain leaving me standing in that church? Humiliating me in front of the entire town? Destroying my life with a 7-word note? His eyes widened slightly at my outburst, but he didn't flinch away from it. I don't expect you to forgive me, Eliza. I don't deserve that. But I thought you might want to know why. All these years, you must have wondered. He was right. I had wondered, had lain awake countless nights turning it over in my mind, examining every conversation, every moment between us, looking for the signs I must have missed. What had I done wrong? What flaw in me had he seen that made him run? All right then, I said, my voice calmer now. Tell me why. He took a deep breath, wincing slightly as if it pained him. I was a coward, he said simply. I'd gotten myself into a mess I couldn't see a way out of. Gambling debts, big ones, to men you didn't want to owe. I'd been playing cards at the crossroads for months, thinking I could win big, solve all our problems, give you the life you deserved. A bitter laugh escaped me. The life I deserved? I deserved a husband who showed up on our wedding day. I know, he said quietly. I know that now. But back then, I was desperate. The night before the wedding, they came to find me. Said I had to pay or there'd be consequences. Not just for me, but for you too. I stared at him, pieces falling into place. The mysterious trips to Baton Rouge, the late-night phone calls, the rumors about him drinking at the crossroads. It had all been true. So instead of telling me the truth, instead of trusting me to stand by you, you just left? Without a word of explanation? The hurt I thought I'd buried decades ago surged fresh and raw. I couldn't face you, he admitted, shame evident in his voice. Couldn't bear to see the disappointment in your eyes when you found out what I'd done. What kind of man I really was. And I thought I was protecting you. Protecting me? The absurdity of it made me want to laugh and cry at the same time. From what, Robert? From loving you? From being your wife? From having a life with the man I thought you were? He shook his head slowly. From me. From the mess I'd made, I thought you were better off without me. That wasn't your decision to make. My voice was steady now, the anger giving way to a strange calm. You didn't protect me. You hurt me more deeply than anyone ever has, before or since. You made me the town joke. The woman left at the altar. Do you have any idea what that did to me? His eyes filled with tears, one escaping to trail down his sunken cheek. I think about it every day. Every single day for 50 years, I've thought about what I did to you, the pain I caused, the life I stole from you. I thought he was exaggerating, trying to gain my sympathy, but something in his expression, a desolation that matched what I'd felt all those years ago, made me wonder if he was telling the truth. What happened after? I asked, curiosity overcoming my resolve to remain detached. After you left Oaksville? He shifted uncomfortably on the bed, and I noticed for the first time the way he favored his right side, as if the left caused him pain. I ran to New Orleans. An old seminary friend let me crash on his couch, found work at a shipping company on the docks. Physical labor, loading cargo. Nothing like the cushy bank job I'd had. I couldn't imagine Robert Mitchell, with his pressed shirts and clean fingernails, doing manual labor. It seemed as incompatible with the man I'd known as this frail figure before me. Met my wife there, he continued. Sarah. She was a secretary at the company. Nothing fancy, but honest work. She was kind. Didn't ask too many questions about my past. He paused, swallowed hard. We were married for 43 years. Did you leave her at the altar too? The words were out before I could stop them, sharper than I'd intended. He didn't bristle at the barb, just shook his head sadly. No, I showed up that time. But maybe I should have run from her too. Might have saved her a lot of heartache. What do you mean? He sighed, a sound so weary it seemed to come from his very soul. I wasn't a good husband, Eliza. I tried, Lord knows I tried. But the gambling, it was like a sickness. I'd quit for a while, promised Sarah it was over, then fall right back into it. Lost our house once. Had to start over. She stuck by me, though, more than I deserved. I thought of the photograph on the wall, the only personal touch in this sparse room. You didn't have children? A shadow crossed his face. No, Sarah couldn't. We talked about adopting, but we were never stable enough, financially or otherwise. Another silence fell between us, filled with the ghosts of lives unlived, children who were never born, paths never taken. And what about you? He asked suddenly. Did you ever marry? Have a family? I shook my head. No, never married. Because of me? The question was so direct, so vulnerable, that it caught me off guard. I considered lying, telling him no, that I'd simply chosen a different path, that he hadn't had that kind of power over my life. But what was the point of lies now, when we were both at the end of our stories? Yes, Robert, because of you. After what you did, I couldn't trust anyone enough to let them that close again. Couldn't risk being hurt like that a second time. The pain that flashed across his face was so raw, so genuine, that I almost regretted my honesty. Almost. I'm so sorry, Eliza, he whispered. So damn sorry. If I could go back. But you can't, I finished for him. None of us can. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. No, we can't go back. But I needed you to know the truth. That it wasn't you. That there was nothing wrong with you. That you are the best thing that ever happened to me. And I threw it all away because I was too weak, too afraid to face my own mistakes. The words hung between us. Too little and too late. Yet somehow, exactly what I'd needed to hear for 50 years. Not that it changed anything. Not that it healed the wounds or gave back the years. But it answered the question that had haunted me through decades of loneliness. It wasn't me. It was never me. Thank you for telling me, I said, surprised at how steady my voice remained. I'd wondered. I know. That's why I had to see you. Before. He gestured vaguely at his failing body. I couldn't leave this world without you knowing the truth. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The anger that had propelled me here was dissipating, leaving in its wake a complicated tangle of emotions I couldn't begin to sort through. Can you ever forgive me, Eliza? He asked, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with half a century of pain. Could I forgive him? Did I want to? Would it set me free? Or would it somehow diminish the life I'd built from the ashes of his betrayal? Before I could answer, a spasm of pain crossed his face, and he doubled over, gasping. I was on my feet instantly, years of looking after Mama's illnesses taking over. Where are your pain meds? I asked, scanning the cluttered side table. He pointed shakily to a bottle, and I quickly read the label, shook out a pill, and handed it to him with the water glass. He swallowed with difficulty, then leaned back against his pillows, his breathing labored. Thank you, he managed after a moment. Happens. Sometimes. Worse at night. Is someone staying with you? I asked, professional concern overriding personal history. He shook his head. Paul, my nephew, checks in. His wife brings dinner. But they have their own lives. Can't expect them to babysit a dying old man. Something in his tone, the resignation, the loneliness, struck a chord in me. I knew what it was to be alone, to face the long nights with only your thoughts for company, to wonder if anyone would notice if you simply vanished. "What does the doctor say?" I asked, settling back in the chair, my purse now set aside, no longer needed as a barrier. "Not much left to say. It's just a matter of time now, making me comfortable as they can." I nodded, familiar with the euphemisms of terminal care. "And are you? Comfortable?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips, as much as a man can be when he's dying with a lifetime of regrets. I didn't know what to say to that. Platitudes seemed inadequate, false comfort worse than none at all. "Will you come back, Eliza?" he asked suddenly, an urgency in his voice I hadn't heard before. "I know I have no right to ask, but I don't have much time left. And seeing you, it's brought me more peace than I've known in 50 years. The request caught me off guard. Come back, voluntarily return to this place of pain and memory, sit at the bedside of the man who'd changed the course of my life with a coward's note and a midnight flight? "I don't know, Robert," I said honestly. "This is a lot to process." He nodded, acceptance in the gesture. "I understand. I'm grateful you came today, more than I can say." I glanced at my watch, surprised to see I'd been there nearly 2 hours. "I should go," I said, rising from the chair. "You need to rest." He didn't argue, which told me more about his condition than any doctor's prognosis could. The Robert I'd known would have tried to keep me there, would have used every charm at his disposal to make me stay just a little longer. I gathered my purse, moved toward the door. Then, following an impulse I didn't quite understand, I turned back. "Is there anything you need? Anything I can bring you?" The surprise in his eyes was almost worth the offer. "Just you, Eliza, but I won't hold you to it if you decide not to come back." I nodded, not committing either way. "Goodbye, Robert." "Goodbye, Eliza May," he said softly. "And thank you for hearing me out, for letting me see you one more time." I stepped out into the bright Louisiana sunshine, blinking against the sudden light. My car sat waiting, a familiar anchor in a sea of uncertainty. I got in, started the engine, and sat there for a long moment, hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. What had I expected from this meeting? Vindication? Revenge? A chance to show him what he'd missed? What he'd thrown away? Instead, I'd found an old man dying alone in a borrowed trailer, carrying 50 years of regret as heavily as I'd carried 50 years of pain. As I drove back toward town, past the fields and strip malls, the new houses and old memories, I realized something that stopped me cold. The hatred I'd nursed for Robert Mitchell, the burning coal I'd kept alive in my heart for half a century, had dimmed. Not extinguished, perhaps, but changed somehow, transmuted into something more complex, more human. And for the first time in 50 years, I wondered what it might be like to set down that burden, to walk through whatever time I had left without the weight of that old betrayal shaping every step. I pulled into the parking lot of Walker's General Store, my life's work, the empire I'd built from nothing but determination and grit. The afternoon sun glinted off the windows, the sign I'd painted myself still bright after all these years. Inside, my assistant manager would be running things smoothly, just as I'd taught her. My life would go on, with or without closure from Robert Mitchell. But as I sat there, keys in the ignition, I knew with a certainty that surprised me that I would go back to that trailer. Not for him, or at least not only for him, but for me. For the chance to finally face the ghost that had haunted me for 50 years. For the opportunity to decide, once and for all, whether forgiveness was something I could offer. Not because he deserved it, but because I deserved peace. The decision made, I put the car in drive and headed home. Tomorrow would be soon enough to figure out what came next. Tonight, I had 50 years of questions to sort through, and at least one answer I hadn't expected. Robert Mitchell had never stopped thinking about me. Just as, despite my best efforts, I had never quite stopped thinking about him. And in that symmetry of regret, perhaps there was something to build on. Not a future. It was far too late for that. But an ending. An ending we could both live with, for whatever time remained. I'd been sitting in my car outside Robert Mitchell's trailer for almost 20 minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles had gone white. The morning sun beat down on the windshield, making the inside of my old Buick feel like an oven, but I couldn't make myself move. What was I doing here? Was I really about to walk back into that man's life after he'd shattered mine 50 years ago? Yesterday's visit had left me more unsettled than I wanted to admit. Seeing Robert, so frail, so clearly dying, had stirred up feelings I thought I'd buried decades ago. Not love, certainly. That had died in a church filled with gardenias and whispers. But something else, something complicated that I couldn't quite name. "Just go home, Eliza," I muttered to myself. "He doesn't deserve your time." But something kept me sitting there, staring at that shabby trailer with its hastily built wheelchair ramp. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the need for answers I'd waited 50 years to hear. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the realization that I was tired of carrying this burden, this anger that had shaped my entire adult life. Finally, I grabbed the paper bag from the passenger seat and made my way to the door. I'd spent the morning baking. Not that I'd admit I'd done it for him, but the peach cobbler sitting in that bag was still warm from the oven. When I knocked, there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, wondering if he was sleeping. Still nothing. A flicker of worry passed through me. Had he passed during the night? Was I too late? I tried the door and found it unlocked. "Robert?" I called, pushing it open cautiously. "It's Eliza. You decent?" The trailer was quiet, except for the soft whir of a small fan in the corner. Robert was in his hospital bed, eyes closed, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. For a moment I just stood there, watching him sleep. He looked even worse than yesterday, if that was possible. The skin around his eyes was bruised with exhaustion, his cheeks sunken, his breathing labored. I set the cobbler on the counter and was about to leave when his eyes fluttered open. "Eliza?" His voice was barely a whisper. "You came back." Something in his tone, surprise mixed with gratitude, made my chest tighten. "Said I might," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Brought you something." His eyes followed me as I retrieved the paper bag and set it on his bedside table. "Peach cobbler," I explained. "Made it this morning." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You remembered." "Course I remembered. It was your favorite." I busied myself straightening the items on his table, not wanting to meet his gaze. "Your mama taught me how to make it just the way you liked. Extra cinnamon, light on the nutmeg." "I haven't had homemade cobbler in..." He paused, thinking. "Must be 15 years since Sarah passed." I nodded, finally looking at him. "You want some now? I can warm it up if you've got a microwave." He shook his head slightly. "Maybe later. Don't have much appetite these days." He gestured weakly toward the recliner. "Sit, please?" I sat, smoothing my dress over my knees, feeling suddenly awkward. Yesterday's visit had had a purpose, to confront him, to get answers. But today? What was I doing here today? "I didn't think you'd come back," Robert said after a moment. "After everything I told you yesterday." "Neither did I admitted. But I woke up this morning and, well, here I am." We sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the whirring fan and Robert's labored breathing. It was strange, this quiet between us. Not comfortable exactly, but not as tense as I would have expected. Just two old people with a lifetime of regrets between them. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday." I finally broke the silence. "About why you left. About the gambling debts." He nodded, his eyes never leaving my face. "I was a coward, Eliza. Plain and simple." "Yes, you were," I agreed, not unkindly. "But I've been wondering, what would have happened if you'd told me? If you'd been honest about the mess you were in?" Robert looked away, toward the single window with its yellowed blind half drawn against the morning sun. "I've wondered that too, so many times over the years. And? He sighed, the sound rattling in his chest. I think you would have stood by me. That's the kind of woman you were. Loyal, strong, braver than I ever was. He looked back at me, his eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. And that's what scared me most of all, that you'd try to save me and we'd both end up ruined. I considered his words, turning them over in my mind. Would I have stood by him? The young Eliza May, so in love, so full of dreams. Yes, she probably would have. For better or worse, that's what we promised, isn't it? You didn't give me the chance to choose, I said quietly. You made that decision for both of us. I know. His voice broke on the words. It's the greatest regret of my life, Eliza May. The thing I would change if I could go back. A silence fell between us again, heavy with possibilities that would never be realized, paths never taken. How was your life, Robert? I asked suddenly. Really, not just the outline you gave me yesterday. Were you happy? He thought for a long moment, his gaze distant. Parts of it were good, he said slowly. I liked my work at the shipping company, made some friends there. Sarah was a good woman, better than I deserved. We had some good years before her drinking got bad. He paused, swallowed hard. But there was always something missing, a hole that nothing could fill. What was that? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Purpose, maybe. The feeling that I was where I was supposed to be, doing what I was meant to do. His eyes met mine again. You. The simplicity of that single word, you, hit me like a physical blow. All these years, I'd imagined him living the life he'd wanted, free of small-town constraints, happy in his choice to leave me behind. To hear that he'd carried his own emptiness all this time was unsettling. Did you ever think about coming back? I asked. Before now, I mean. Every day for 50 years, he answered without hesitation. Especially at first. I'd get in my car, start driving toward Oaksville, get as far as the parish line, then turn around. He gave a small, sad smile. Coward to the end. That was me. What stopped you? Really? Shame, he said simply. The longer I stayed away, the harder it was to face what I'd done. To face you. And then there was Sarah. I'd made promises to her too, even if they weren't the ones I really wanted to keep. I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to. I knew about promises, about duty, about the choices that shape a life one small decision at a time. And you, Eliza? Robert asked, his voice softer now. Were you happy? Did you find what you were looking for? I thought about my life, the store I'd built, the respect I'd earned, the independence I'd found. I made a good life, I said carefully. Not the one I'd planned, but a good one. I'm proud of what I accomplished. But were you happy? He pressed. I looked down at my hands. Old hands now, spotted with age, the veins prominent beneath thin skin. The hands that had never worn the wedding ring he'd promised me. The hands that had built a business, counted money, kept ledgers, but never cradled a child of my own. I had moments of happiness, I said truthfully. Good days, accomplishments. But there was always something missing for me, too. What was that? He echoed my earlier question. I met his gaze steadily. Trust. The ability to let someone in completely. To believe that they wouldn't leave. A tear slipped down his sunken cheek, leaving a shining trail on his sallow skin. I'm so sorry, Eliza. So damn sorry. And suddenly, watching this broken old man cry for the life we might have had, something shifted inside me. The wall I'd built around my heart, brick by brick over 50 years, began to crumble. Not all at once, but enough that I could feel the change. A loosening, an opening, a release. I reached out and took his hand, the hand I'd once expected to hold me through a lifetime. It felt different now. Fragile, the bones too prominent beneath papery skin, but it was still his hand, and for the first time in half a century, I was touching the man who had been my first and only love. I know you're sorry, Robert, I said softly. I believe that now. He gripped my hand with surprising strength, his eyes holding mine. I need to tell you something, Eliza. Something I should have said yesterday, but I was too afraid. What is it? I never stopped loving you. The words came out in a rush, as if he feared he wouldn't have the courage to say them if he hesitated. Not for one day in 50 years. I loved you when I wrote that note. I loved you when I married Sarah. I loved you every day of my life since. I felt tears spring to my eyes, the first I'd cried over Robert Mitchell in decades. Why are you telling me this now, when it's too late? Because I'm dying, he said simply. And I can't go with this unsaid. You deserved better than me, Eliza. You deserved someone who would stand beside you through thick and thin. Someone brave enough to face his mistakes. He squeezed my hand. But I need you to know that even though I failed you in every way that matters, I loved you with everything I had, even when that wasn't enough. I didn't know what to say. What do you say when the man who broke your heart tells you he's loved you all along? When the reason for your life's greatest pain claims it was done out of love? Would you like to hear something strange? I asked finally. He nodded, still holding my hand. I think I never stopped loving you either. The admission shocked me even as I said it, but I knew it was true. I tried to hate you. Lord knows I had reason. But underneath all the anger, all the hurt, there was still love. That's what made it hurt so bad. Robert closed his eyes, tears streaming freely now. I don't deserve that, Eliza. I don't deserve your love. Never did. Maybe not, I agreed. But that's the thing about love. It's not about deserving. We sat like that for a long time, holding hands across the gulf of 50 years, both of us crying silently for what might have been, for the life we might have shared, for the children we might have raised together, for all the ordinary joys and sorrows we might have weathered side by side. After a while, Robert's breathing changed, becoming more labored, and I noticed a grimace of pain cross his face. Your medicine, I said, reaching for the pill bottle on his table. Is it time? He nodded, and I helped him take the medication, holding the glass to his lips when his hand shook too much to manage it. It was an intimate act, caring for someone this way, and it struck me how strange life was. That I should end up here, tending to the man who had once abandoned me. Thank you, he whispered when he'd swallowed the pill. His eyes were heavy now, the medication already working to dull the pain. Will you stay until I fall asleep? I hesitated only a moment before nodding. I'll stay. He closed his eyes, his breathing gradually becoming more regular as the pain medication took effect. I continued to hold his hand, watching his face in repose. Even ravaged by age and illness, I could still see traces of the handsome young man who had swept me off my feet all those years ago. The curve of his jaw, the shape of his nose, the way his hair fell across his forehead. Eliza, he murmured, already half asleep. I wish... What do you wish, Robert? I asked softly. I wish I'd been brave enough to love you the way you deserved. And with those words, something broke free inside me, a dam I'd built to hold back decades of grief and anger and loss. I bent my head and wept, truly wept, for the first time since that awful day in the church. Not silent tears, but deep, racking sobs that seemed to come from the very core of my being. I cried for the young woman in her wedding dress, waiting for a groom who never came. I cried for the life we might have had together. I cried for Robert, so close to the end of his journey, carrying 50 years of regret. And I cried for myself, for the walls I'd built around my heart, for the love I'd denied myself out of fear and pride. When my tears finally subsided, I looked up to find Robert watching me, his eyes clear despite the medication. I never saw you cry, he said quietly. Not even that day. Ruth Ann told me later that you fainted, but you didn't cry. I couldn't, I admitted. If I'd started, I might never have stopped. He nodded, understanding. And now? I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, feeling lighter somehow, as if the tears had washed away something heavy I'd been carrying. Now, I think maybe it was time. Robert's eyelids were drooping, the medication finally pulling him toward sleep. "Will you come back tomorrow?" he asked, his words slurring slightly. "Please?" I thought about it. Yesterday I'd come for answers, for some kind of closure. Today I'd come. Why? Because I couldn't stay away? Because 50 years of questions couldn't be answered in a single conversation? Or because, despite everything, there was still a connection between us, damaged, twisted by time and pain, but real nonetheless? "Yes," I heard myself say. "I'll come back tomorrow." A smile touched his lips as he drifted off to sleep. "Thank you, Eliza May." I sat there for a while longer, holding his hand, watching him sleep. Then gently, I disengaged my fingers from his and stood. I adjusted his blanket, made sure his water was within reach, and quietly left the trailer. Outside, the day had warmed considerably, the Louisiana sun beating down on the gravel driveway. I stood for a moment, blinking in the brightness, feeling strangely disoriented. The world looked the same as it had when I'd gone in, the same dusty road, the same patch of sky visible between the pine trees, but something fundamental had changed. I got into my car and sat there, hands on the wheel, not yet starting the engine. The tears had left me feeling hollow, but not in a bad way. It was more like I'd been cleaned out, emptied of old poisons that had been festering for far too long. For 50 years, I'd defined myself by what had happened in that church. I'd been the woman left at the altar, the cautionary tale, the object of pity turned object of respect through sheer force of will. I'd built my identity around never being vulnerable again, never trusting, never risking my heart. But sitting there in my car, having just told Robert Mitchell I'd never stopped loving him, I realized something profound. I'd been wrong all these years. Not about the pain, that had been real enough. Not about the humiliation, that had been devastating, but about what it meant, about who I was because of it. I wasn't just the woman who'd been left. I was the woman who'd survived, who'd built something from nothing, who'd earned respect on her own terms. And maybe, just maybe, I was also still the woman who could love, who could forgive, who could find some measure of peace before it was too late. As I started the car and pulled away from Robert's trailer, I felt lighter than I had in decades. Not because the past had changed, it hadn't. Not because the pain had been erased, it couldn't be. But because for the first time in 50 years, I was allowing myself to feel something besides anger toward the man who had changed the course of my life. I was allowing myself to remember not just the betrayal, but the love that had come before it. And in doing so, I was reclaiming a part of myself I'd thought was lost forever. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know how many more tomorrows Robert had left, or what would happen between us in whatever time remained. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Today, in that shabby trailer at the parish line, something had been healed in me. Not completely, perhaps, but enough. Enough to let go of some of the bitterness I'd carried for so long. Enough to consider the possibility that forgiveness might be a gift I gave not just to Robert, but to myself. As I drove back toward town, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at me was old, yes, lined face, silver hair, eyes that had seen too much. But there was something different in those eyes now. A softness that hadn't been there before. A peace I hadn't expected to find. "Well, Eliza May," I said to my reflection, "seems like you might not be done growing yet after all." And for the first time in a very long time, I smiled. A real smile that reached all the way to my newly softened eyes. Because whatever happened next, I knew that the woman driving back into Oaksville was not quite the same woman who had driven out. And that, I decided, might not be such a bad thing after all. In the days that followed, I found myself making that drive out to Robert's trailer like it was the most natural thing in the world. Each morning, I'd wake up, go through my usual routine, shower, dress, fix my hair in its neat silver bun, then pack something into a basket. Sometimes peach cobbler, sometimes chicken soup made from scratch, sometimes just fresh flowers to brighten that dreary little room. I told myself it was Christian charity, nothing more. Just one human being helping another in their time of need. But deep down, I knew it was more complicated than that. Word spread through Oaksville like wildfire. Miss Eliza visiting Robert Mitchell every day? The woman he'd left at the altar 50 years ago now bringing him food, sitting by his bed, caring for him in his final days? It was better than any soap opera on television. "You're the talk of the town," Ruth Ann told me over coffee at my kitchen table. Now in her 70s herself, with gray hair and arthritis in her fingers, she was still my closest friend. Mary Louise from the pharmacy says her phone's been ringing off the hook with people calling for updates on you and Robert. "Let them talk," I said, surprising both of us with my indifference. "I'm too old to care what people think anymore." "But why, Eliza?" she asked, leaning forward, her eyes searching mine. "After what he did to you, why are you helping him now?" I considered her question carefully. Why was I doing this? Was it forgiveness? Closure? Some twisted form of revenge? Showing Robert what he'd missed all these years? "I don't know exactly," I admitted finally. "Maybe I need this as much as he does. Maybe I'm tired of carrying around 50 years of hate. It gets heavy after a while." Ruth Ann nodded slowly. "Does this mean you've forgiven him?" That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? Had I forgiven Robert Mitchell? Could I forgive him? "I'm working on it," I said truthfully. "Some days I think I have. Other days I remember how it felt standing in that church, and the anger comes right back." "Well," Ruth Ann said, patting my hand, "if anyone deserves your forgiveness, it's not him. It's you, Eliza. You deserve to be free of this burden." Her words stayed with me as I drove to Robert's trailer that afternoon. The sky was dark with storm clouds, promising rain before evening. I'd brought a thermos of homemade chicken soup and a loaf of fresh-baked bread, knowing how little appetite he had these days. When I arrived, I was surprised to find Robert's nephew, Paul, sitting on the steps of the trailer, smoking a cigarette. He stood when he saw me, grinding the butt under his heel. "Miss Eliza," he nodded, his expression hard to read. "Paul," I replied, clutching my basket a little tighter. "How is he today?" "Not good," he said flatly. "Doctor came this morning. Says it won't be long now. Days maybe, not weeks." I felt a sudden hollowness in my chest. I'd known Robert was dying, of course. That was the whole reason he'd come back to Oaksville. But hearing it stated so plainly, with such a short timeline, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "I see," I managed to say. Paul looked at me for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "Miss Eliza, can I speak plainly with you?" "Of course." "I don't understand what you're doing here." His tone wasn't accusatory, just genuinely confused. "My wife thinks it's the sweetest thing she's ever seen, but I don't get it. Uncle Robert, what he did to you. My daddy told me that story growing up. Used it as a lesson in what not to do to a woman you love." He shook his head. "So, why are you here every day, bringing food, sitting with him? Why would you care if he dies alone or not?" It was essentially the same question Ruth Ann had asked, but coming from Paul, Robert's blood, a man who'd grown up hearing the story from the other side. It hit differently. "Your uncle did a terrible thing to me a long time ago," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. "But holding on to that hurt hasn't done me any good. It's just made me hard, made me build walls, made me miss out on chances to love and be loved." I looked toward the trailer door. "I'm not here for him, Paul. I'm here for me, to see if I can find some kind of peace before it's too late." Paul studied me, then nodded. "You're something else, Miss Eliza. Uncle Robert said you were the strongest woman he ever knew. I see what he means now." He stepped aside. He's been asking for you all morning." Inside, the trailer was dim and quiet, except for the soft hiss of an oxygen tank. Robert was propped up in the hospital bed, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow and raspy. He looked even worse than the day before, thinner somehow, his skin with a gray undertone that scared me. "Robert," I said softly, setting my basket on the counter. His eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly. "Eliza," he whispered, a smile ghosting across his lips. "You came. I said I would, didn't I?" I moved to the chair beside his bed, taking in all the new medical equipment that hadn't been there yesterday. The oxygen tank, the IV stand, the bedside commode. "I brought some soup." "Can't eat," he whispered, "but thank you." I nodded, trying to hide my concern at how much he'd deteriorated overnight. "The doctor came today?" "Hospice now," he said, his voice barely audible. "No more. Fighting it." Hospice. The word hung between us, heavy with meaning. Not treatment to cure or improve, but care to ease the final journey. I'd been through it with Mama, knew what it meant, what was coming. "Paul told me," I said softly. "I'm sorry, Robert." He shook his head slightly. "Don't be. Been ready. Long time." His breathing was labored, each word an effort. "Just needed to see you. One more time." I took his hand, the bones feeling like twigs beneath the tissue paper skin. "Well, I'm here, not going anywhere." He seemed to relax at that, his eyes drifting closed again. For a while I just sat beside him, holding his hand, listening to the rasp of his breathing, the occasional distant rumble of thunder as the storm approached. "Eliza," he murmured after a time, not opening his eyes. "Ask you something." "What is it, Robert?" "When I'm gone." He paused, gathering strength. "Will you come to my funeral? Or would that be too much?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't thought that far ahead, hadn't considered what would happen after. Would I attend Robert Mitchell's funeral? Walk into First Baptist again? Face the congregation? Many of whom would remember that other ceremony 50 years ago? The symmetry was almost too perfect, too poetic. The church where he failed to show up for our wedding would be where I'd say my final goodbye to him. "If you don't want to understand," he added when I didn't immediately respond. "I'll be there," I said firmly. "I promise." His fingers tightened around mine, just barely. "Thank you." Another silence fell between us, comfortable in its way. Outside, I heard the first patter of raindrops on the metal roof of the trailer, a sound that quickened until it became a steady drumming. "Remember?" Robert asked, his eyes still closed. "Our first date?" "The ice cream parlor," I nodded. "Thompson's." "No," he whispered. "After, walking you home. Started to rain. The memory came back in a rush. We'd been walking back from Thompson's when a summer storm hit suddenly, drenching us both. Instead of running for cover, Robert had taken my hand and twirled me around in the middle of Oak Street, both of us laughing as the rain soaked through our clothes. Then, with water running down our faces, he'd kissed me for the first time. It had been magical, perfect, like a scene from a movie. "I remember," I said softly. "Happiest day of my life," he murmured. Then, so quietly, I almost missed it. "Should have married you that day, before I could mess it up." I blinked back unexpected tears. We were just kids, Robert. Kids who knew what mattered. His breathing seemed to be growing more labored. "Love, that's all. That matters in the end. Everything else, just noise." I sat with him until he drifted off to sleep, the rain continuing to drum on the roof, creating a cocoon of sound around us. When Paul's wife Marta arrived to take over, I reluctantly let go of Robert's hand and gathered my things. "He's having a good day," Marta said, her voice low as she walked me to the door. "The morphine helps with the pain." I nodded, but we both knew what a good day meant in this context. It meant he was lucid, able to speak. It didn't mean he was getting better. There would be no getting better. "I'll be back tomorrow morning," I told her. "Miss Eliza," she hesitated. "Paul told me what you said earlier, about finding peace. I just wanted to say, I think it's beautiful what you're doing. Not many people could do it." I didn't know how to respond to that. It didn't feel beautiful from the inside. It felt messy and complicated and sometimes painful, but also, somehow, necessary. "Thank you, Marta. See you tomorrow." The rain had eased to a gentle drizzle as I walked to my car. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine, watching drops slide down the windshield, merging and separating in unpredictable patterns. Rather like life itself, I thought. You never knew which paths would cross, which would join together, which would diverge again. When I got back to town, instead of going straight home, I found myself driving to First Baptist. The church stood as it always had, white clapboard with a tall steeple, nestled among ancient oak trees that had witnessed generations of Oaksville's joys and sorrows. I parked across the street and just looked at it, remembering. In my mind's eye, I could see it as it had been that May Day in 1974. White gardenias and pink roses decorating the altar, ribbons on the end of each pew, the church packed with guests in their Sunday best, whispering and wondering as the minutes ticked past 3 o'clock. The moment Pastor Mitchell had come to tell me Robert wasn't coming. The humiliation, the shock, the disbelief. For 50 years, I'd avoided this church as much as possible. I'd transferred my membership to Second Baptist on the other side of town, only coming back to First for funerals when I couldn't avoid it. Even then, I'd sit in the back, arrive late, leave early. The building itself had become a symbol of my deepest hurt, my greatest shame. Yet now, looking at it in the gentle rain, I felt something shift inside me. It was just a building, wood and nails and paint, not the source of my pain, merely the setting. The hurt had come from Robert's actions, from my own expectations, from a young man's cowardice and a young woman's shattered dreams. The church itself was innocent, and soon I would walk back through those doors for Robert Mitchell's funeral. Not as the jilted bride, but as, what? A friend? A caretaker? The woman who'd chosen to sit with him at the end, to offer forgiveness when he needed it most? I didn't have a name for what I was to Robert now, or he to me. We were beyond the usual categories, beyond the neat boxes that relationships usually fit into. We were just two people at the end of a long, complicated story, trying to find some meaning in the final chapter. As I drove home, I felt a curious lightness in my chest. Not happiness, exactly. There was too much sadness mingled with it for that, but something like relief. Like setting down a heavy load I'd been carrying for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. The next morning, I woke to sunshine streaming through my bedroom window, the storm having passed in the night. I went through my usual routine, shower, dress, fix my hair, then packed fresh biscuits and honey into my basket. Robert probably wouldn't eat them, but it gave me purpose to bring something. When I arrived at the trailer, something felt different immediately. Paul's truck was there, along with another car I didn't recognize. The door was partially open, and I could hear voices inside, low, serious voices. My heart sank as I approached. Somehow, I knew before I even stepped inside. The hospital bed was empty, the sheets stripped. Paul stood in the kitchenette with a man in a dark suit. The funeral director from Palmer's in town, I realized. "Miss Eliza," Paul said when he saw me, his voice thick. "I'm sorry. I tried to call, but—" "When?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady as I set my basket on the counter. "About 4 this morning," Paul said. "The hospice nurse was with him. Said he went peaceful, no pain." I nodded, taking this in. 4 this morning. While I slept in my bed across town, Robert Mitchell had taken his last breath in this shabby little trailer. The man I'd once loved, then hated, then, whatever complicated emotion had grown between us these past days, was gone. Did he say anything? I asked, not sure why it mattered, but needing to know. Paul nodded. Asked for you, actually. Said to tell you, he looked uncomfortable. Said to tell you he'll be on time for this one. A small, sad laugh escaped me. Even at the end, Robert had maintained his sense of irony. He'd be on time for his funeral, if not for our wedding. The service will be at First Baptist, Paul continued. Thursday at 2, nothing fancy, just a simple service, like he wanted. I'll be there, I said, remembering my promise to Robert. Is there anything I can do to help? Paul shook his head. It's all taken care of. Uncle Robert arranged everything before he came back to Oaksville, knew what was coming. Of course he had. He'd come back to die, to make peace, to close the circle. He'd accomplished all three. I left shortly after, my basket of biscuits still on the counter. There was nothing more for me to do there. As I drove back toward town, I felt numb, suspended in a strange emotional limbo. I wasn't devastated by Robert's death. I'd known it was coming, had prepared myself for it. But I wasn't unmoved either. Something significant had ended, not just a life, but a connection, a shared history, a complicated tangle of love and hurt and forgiveness that had defined so much of my existence. For the next 2 days, I went through the motions of my routine. I opened the store, checked inventory, balanced the books. I spoke to customers, answered the phone, signed for deliveries. But a part of me was somewhere else, thinking about Robert, about our brief reconnection, about the things said and unsaid between us. Word of his death spread through Oaksville quickly. People looked at me differently, some with curiosity, some with sympathy, some with something like admiration. The story had evolved. I was no longer just the woman left at the altar, but the woman who had risen above her pain to forgive the man who'd hurt her. It was a better story, I supposed, more redemptive. But like most stories people told about others' lives, it simplified something complex, flattened something multidimensional. Thursday arrived clear and warm, a perfect Louisiana spring day. I dressed carefully in a dark green dress, my best one, saved for special occasions, and drove to First Baptist. The parking lot was only about half full when I arrived. Robert had been gone from Oaksville for 50 years. Most of the people who'd known him well were either dead or had lost touch long ago. The attendees were mostly Paul's friends and family, a few old-timers from the church who remembered the Mitchell family, and I suspected a fair number of curious onlookers drawn by the dramatic story of our reunion. I sat in the back row, not hiding exactly, but not drawing attention to myself either. The casket at the front was closed, draped with a simple spray of white lilies. No gardenias this time, I noted with a strange relief. The service was brief and dignified. The new pastor, a young man who'd never known Robert, spoke of redemption and forgiveness in general terms. Paul gave a short eulogy, speaking of his uncle's generosity over the years, his quiet support of Paul's family. There was no mention of the scandal that had once rocked this very church, no reference to the young man who had fled his own wedding in this same building half a century earlier. It was as if that part of Robert's history had been erased, or at least politely overlooked. When the service ended, I remained seated as others filed out toward the cemetery for the burial. I wasn't family. I had no place at the graveside. My promise to Robert had been to attend his funeral, and I had kept that promise. As the church emptied, Ruth Ann appeared at the end of my pew, dressed in somber navy blue. She'd come for me, I realized, not for Robert, to support me through this strange, surreal moment. "You okay?" she asked, sliding in beside me. "I think so," I said, surprised to find it was true. "It feels finished somehow, like the end of a story that went on too long." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Want to skip the burial? We could go get coffee at Pearl's." I considered it, then shook my head. "No, I think I need to see it through to the end." So we drove to the cemetery, parking at a discreet distance from the small gathering around the open grave. We stood under a massive oak tree, far enough away not to intrude, close enough to hear the pastor's final prayers. When the short service concluded, people drifted away in twos and threes, heading back to their cars. Paul spotted us as he was leaving and detoured in our direction. He looked exhausted, his face drawn with the strain of the past few days. "Miss Eliza," he said, nodding to me and Ruth Ann, "thank you for coming. It would have meant a lot to him." "It was a lovely service," I said, very dignified. "There's a small reception at our house if you'd like to come," he offered, though I could tell it was more politeness than genuine invitation. "Thank you, but I think I'll head home," I declined gracefully. "It's been a difficult few days." He nodded, understanding. Then, reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small envelope. "Uncle Robert asked me to give you this, said you'd know what it meant." I took the envelope, feeling its slight weight in my hand. "Thank you, Paul." He hesitated, then added, "He talked about you a lot, you know. Not just at the end, but over the years. Always wondered what happened to you, how your life turned out." A small, sad smile touched his lips. "When he found out he was dying, the first thing he said was that he needed to see you one more time. Said he couldn't go without making things right." I didn't know how to respond to that. Did one ever really make something like that right? Or just find a way to live with it, to move forward despite it? "I'm glad he had the chance," I said finally. "And I'm glad I did too." After Paul left, Ruth Ann and I walked slowly back to our cars. The cemetery was peaceful now, the only sound the rustle of oak leaves overhead and distant birdsong. "What's in the envelope?" Ruth Ann asked, nodding to the small white rectangle I still held. "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I think I'll open it at home." We parted with a promise to have coffee the next day. I drove home slowly, the envelope sitting on the passenger seat beside me, somehow feeling heavier than its physical weight would suggest. At home, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table, turning the envelope over in my hands. My name was written on the front in a shaky version of the once fluid handwriting I remembered from love letters long ago. Eliza May. Finally, I opened it. Inside was a small golden locket on a delicate chain, the same locket Robert had given me on my 25th birthday, just months before our wedding. The locket I'd returned to him through his father after the wedding that wasn't, unable to bear the sight of it. With trembling fingers, I opened the tiny clasp. Inside, just as it had been 50 years ago, were our initials intertwined, EM and RM, and on the opposite side, a miniature photograph that hadn't been there before, a recent picture of me, clearly cut from the article the Oaksville Gazette had run last year when I was honored as Business Owner of the Year. He'd kept the locket all these years, had carried it with him from Oaksville to New Orleans, through his marriage to Sarah, through decades of a life that had gone in such a different direction than we'd planned. And somehow, he'd obtained a current picture of me to place inside it before he died. With the locket was a small slip of paper, a note in the same shaky handwriting. "Eliza, the love of my life, then and now, thank you for your forgiveness." It meant everything. Robert. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, the locket in my palm, the note beside my cooling tea. Outside, life in Oaksville continued. Cars passed on the street, children called to each other in the fading afternoon light, my neighbor's dog barked at a passing cat. The ordinary sounds of a world that had already begun to move on, as it always did after a death, after an ending. Robert Mitchell was gone. The young man who had swept me off my feet, who had promised me forever and then vanished before it could begin, no longer existed in this world. Neither did the young woman who had waited in her wedding dress, who had crumbled under the weight of public humiliation, who had rebuilt herself into someone harder, more cautious, more alone. We were both gone, those young people with their dreams and fears. What remained was this moment, this kitchen, this woman I had become, a woman who had, in the end, found the strength to forgive not just Robert, but herself. for being blind to the signs, for letting one man's actions define so much of her life, for building walls that kept others out but also kept her imprisoned within. I closed my fingers around the locket, feeling its edges press into my palm. Then I lifted it by its chain and fastened it around my neck, where it settled against my skin like it belonged there, not as a symbol of what might have been, but as a reminder of what was. A life lived on my own terms, a strength found in adversity, and in the end, a capacity for forgiveness I hadn't known I possessed. Whatever came next, however many years I had left in this world, I would face them differently than I had the past 50. Not defined by an old hurt, not hiding behind carefully constructed barriers, but open to whatever possibilities remained. It wasn't a second chance at youth or love. It was too late for that. But it was perhaps a chance at something else. Peace, acceptance, a gentler way of moving through whatever time was left. And for now, for today, that seemed like enough. More than enough, really. It seemed like a gift. In the months following Robert's funeral, I felt like I was waking up from a long, strange dream. I'd spent 50 years defining myself by what had happened in that church, by the humiliation, by the walls I'd built to protect myself. Now that Robert was gone, truly gone, I had to figure out who Eliza May Walker was without that burden of hurt and anger. Spring turned to summer, and Oaksville settled back into its usual rhythms. The scandal of my reconciliation with Robert faded, replaced by newer gossips, the mayor's daughter eloping, the high school principal retiring after 30 years, the Piggly Wiggly closing down after the new Walmart opened on the highway. One morning in late July, I was doing inventory at the store when Ruth Ann walked in, looking more purposeful than usual. "Get your purse," she announced without preamble. "We're going for a drive." "I can't just leave," I protested. "The store?" "Jenny can watch things for an hour," she said, referring to my assistant manager. "Come on, Eliza. I've got something to show you." Curious despite myself, I followed her out to her car, a sensible Buick not unlike my own. We drove in companionable silence through town, past the new developments on the outskirts, until we turned down a road I hadn't been on in years. The road to First Baptist Church. "Ruth Ann," I said warningly, "what are we doing here?" "Just trust me," she replied, parking in the nearly empty lot. "Come on." Reluctantly, I followed her toward the church. The last time I'd been here was for Robert's funeral, and before that, well, we both knew when. My steps slowed as we approached the main entrance. "Not that way," Ruth Ann said, tugging my arm. "Around back, to the garden." Behind the church was a small memorial garden I'd forgotten about, a peaceful space with benches and flowering shrubs where church members could sit and reflect. In the center was a simple stone fountain bubbling quietly in the morning sun. "Look," Ruth Ann said, pointing to a small stone marker near the fountain that I hadn't noticed before. I stepped closer, bending to read the inscription. "In memory of James and Lucille Walker, faithful servants." My parents' names, on a memorial stone in the church garden. "Who?" I began, my voice catching. "Paul Mitchell put it in last month," Ruth Ann explained quietly. "Said his uncle wanted it done. Said Robert felt he owed them that much, for how he'd hurt their daughter." I sank onto the nearest bench, my legs suddenly unsteady. Robert had arranged this, a memorial to my parents at the church where he'd once broken my heart. A final act of, what, contrition, respect, something deeper? "He didn't tell you about this?" Ruth Ann asked, sitting beside me. I shook my head. "No. We talked about a lot of things in those last days, but not this." We sat in silence for a while, watching the play of sunlight on the water in the fountain. A pair of cardinals flitted among the crepe myrtle trees, flashes of brilliant red against the green foliage. "You know what's strange?" I said finally. "For 50 years, I couldn't come to this church without feeling humiliated all over again. Like the building itself was somehow responsible for what happened. But sitting here now, it's just A place. A peaceful place. Ruth Ann nodded, understanding in her eyes. That's because you've let it go, Eliza. The hurt, the shame, you've finally put it down. Had I? I thought about it as we drove back to town. The anger that had fueled me for so long, the walls I'd built around my heart, they weren't gone entirely. 50 years of habits don't disappear overnight, but they had changed, softened, become less defining. The transformation continued in small, almost imperceptible ways over the following weeks. I found myself smiling more at customers in the store, taking time to chat instead of maintaining my usual efficient but distant demeanor. I accepted an invitation to join the Town Beautification Committee, something I would have dismissed as a waste of time before. I even agreed to host the monthly book club meeting at my apartment, opening my private space to others for the first time in years. But the biggest change came in late August, when I received a letter from Paul Mitchell. Inside was a small brass key and a brief note. Miss Eliza, Uncle Robert left something for you in a safety deposit box at First National. This is the key. Box, Year 147, Paul. I stared at that key for 3 days before I worked up the courage to go to the bank. What could Robert possibly have left for me? The locket had been his final gift, his last word. What more could there be? Finally, on a quiet Tuesday morning, I drove to First National Bank and presented the key to a young woman at the service desk. I need to access this safety deposit box, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She led me to a private room after verifying my ID, returning moments later with a long metal box. Take your time, Ms. Walker. Just ring the bell when you're finished. Alone with the box, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lid. Whatever was inside had been important enough for Robert to ensure I received it after his death. Taking a deep breath, I opened it. Inside was a manila envelope with my name written on it in Robert's handwriting, steadier than the note with the locket, suggesting he'd prepared this before his illness had progressed too far. Beneath the envelope was a smaller box, gift-wrapped in simple white paper with a green ribbon. I opened the envelope first. Inside was a letter, several pages long, and what appeared to be legal documents. Setting those aside for the moment, I unfolded the letter and began to read. My dearest Eliza, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've shown me more kindness in my final days than I ever deserved. I hope that our conversations brought you some measure of peace. They certainly did for me. There are things I couldn't bring myself to say to you face to face, partly out of cowardice, some habits never change, and partly because I didn't want to burden you with them while I was still alive. But they need to be said, and this is my last chance to say them. The first is simple. I'm sorry. Not just for leaving you at the altar, although that remains my greatest shame, but for the life I stole from you. The chance at love, at family, at the future we had planned. My actions that day shaped your life in ways I never had the right to do, and for that, I am profoundly sorry. The second is harder to express, but I'll try. You were right when you said I didn't give you the chance to choose. I made the decision for both of us, out of fear, out of weakness. I've spent 50 years wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to tell you the truth about my gambling debts, about the men who were threatening me. Would you have stood by me? Would we have found a way through it together? I think we would have, and that knowledge has been its own special kind of hell. The third thing I need to say is about Sarah, my wife. She was a good woman who deserved better than me. Our marriage was comfortable, but never truly happy. I think she always knew that my heart belonged to someone else, though we never spoke of it directly. When she passed 5 years ago, I found myself increasingly drawn to thoughts of you, of Oaksville, of the life I'd abandoned. I told myself I had no right to disrupt your life after so long, and I was right. But then came the diagnosis, and suddenly time became very precious indeed. Finally, Eliza, I want you to know that I loved you, always, every day for 50 years. Through my marriage, through my career, through all the ups and downs of a life lived far from where I began. You were my first thought each morning and my last thought each night. The love of my life, the road not taken, my greatest what if. I hope that in our final days together, you found some closure, some healing. I hope that my death brings not sorrow, but release. For both of us, release from the past that has bound us together in such a painful way for so long. The documents enclosed are boring legal things. The deed to a small property outside Oaksville that belonged to my father, which I inherited after his passing. I've transferred it to your name. It's not much, just a couple of acres with an old fishing cabin. But it's peaceful there. A good place to think, to remember, to forget if that's what you need. There's a map enclosed, showing how to find it. The gift is something I've carried with me all these years. Something I should have given you a long time ago. I hope you'll accept it now, not as an attempt to make amends, nothing could do that, but as a symbol of the truth I never stopped believing, that you, Eliza May Walker, were always worthy of being chosen, of being loved, of being put first. With all my heart, Robert, I sat for a long time after reading the letter, tears streaming down my face. The emotions were too complex, too contradictory to name. Grief for what might have been, anger at the wasted years, gratitude for the closure we'd found at the end. And something else, something that felt oddly like freedom, as if the last chains binding me to that long-ago hurt had finally broken. Eventually, I picked up the small gift box, untied the green ribbon, and carefully removed the white paper. Inside was a velvet jeweler's box, worn with age. I opened it with trembling fingers. Nestled against the faded satin lining was a ring. Not just any ring, my engagement ring. The modest diamond solitaire that had belonged to Robert's grandmother, that he'd placed on my finger the night he proposed at the church social. The ring I'd returned to Pastor Mitchell after the wedding. That wasn't, unable to bear the sight of it. He'd kept it. All these years, through everything, he'd kept my ring. I slipped it onto my finger, half expecting it wouldn't fit my arthritic knuckle, but it slid on perfectly, as if it had been waiting all this time to return home. The next morning, I followed the map to Robert's property. It was a short drive, maybe 20 minutes outside town, down a winding dirt road that ended at a small clearing by a creek. The cabin was just as he'd described, simple, weathered, but still sound. Inside was basic, but comfortable. A main room with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchenette, a bedroom just big enough for a double bed, and a surprisingly modern bathroom that had clearly been renovated recently. On the mantelpiece was a framed photograph I recognized from Robert's trailer, him and Sarah in happier days. Next to it was a space, as if waiting for something to fill it. Without really thinking about it, I took out my wallet, removed the small photo I'd carried for years, my parents on their 30th anniversary, and placed it in the empty spot. I spent the day cleaning, airing out the musty rooms, making the place my own. As evening fell, I sat on the small porch in a creaky rocking chair, watching the creek bubble over stones, listening to the cicadas and whippoorwills begin their nightly chorus. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt at peace. Not happy exactly. That seemed too simple a word for the complex emotions swirling within me. But at peace. The burden I'd carried for 50 years had been set down at last, not because it had been erased or forgotten, but because I had finally learned how to carry it differently. Over the next few months, I found myself coming to the cabin often, sometimes just for an afternoon, sometimes for a full weekend. I brought books I'd been meaning to read for years, cooked simple meals on the old stove, took long walks along the creek. Occasionally, Ruth Ann joined me, the two of us sitting on the porch with glasses of sweet tea, talking about everything and nothing. The store continued to thrive under Jenny's day-to-day management, freeing me to step back a bit, to work less feverishly than I had for decades. I still kept an eye on things, still checked the books every week, but I no longer felt the need to control every aspect, to be there from open to close. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, my life began to open up. I accepted dinner invitations I would have declined before. I joined the church choir at Second Baptist, rediscovering a love of music I'd abandoned years ago. I even went on a weekend trip to New Orleans with a group of women from the town beautification committee, something the old Eliza would never have considered. One evening in late October, as I was closing up the store, the bell over the door jingled, and in walked a man I recognized but couldn't immediately place. Tall, distinguished, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Miss Eliza?" he said, his voice deep and pleasant. "I'm not sure if you remember me. James Beaumont." "I was Mr. Beaumont's son," I finished for him. "The lawyer from Baton Rouge." He looked pleased that I remembered. "That's right. Though I'm retired now, moved back to Oaksville last month. My wife passed a couple years ago, and I wanted to come home." We stood there awkwardly for a moment, two elderly people making small talk in the empty store. Then he cleared his throat. "Miss Eliza, I was wondering. I heard you know about a good fishing creek outside town. My grandson's coming to visit next weekend, and I promised to take him fishing. But it's been so long since I've lived here. I don't know the good spots anymore." I hesitated only briefly. "As a matter of fact, I do know a place. It's mine now. A little cabin on Cypress Creek, about 20 minutes out. The fishing's excellent there. Would you be willing to show me sometime, before my grandson arrives, so I can look competent when he gets here?" His smile was self-deprecating, charming, and to my surprise, I heard myself say, "I'd be happy to. How about Saturday morning? Say, around 9? After he left, I stood in the middle of my store, wondering what had just happened. Had I just agreed to what amounted to a date? At 76 years old? The thought was so absurd I almost laughed out loud. But then again, why not? James Beaumont wasn't Robert. No one would ever be Robert, for better or worse. But he was a kind man with gentle eyes who wanted to impress his grandson. And I was a woman who, after 50 years of isolation, was finally learning how to open her heart again. Not to romance necessarily. I was too old, too set in my ways for that kind of upheaval. But to connection, to friendship, to the possibility that life still held surprises, even at this late date. As I locked up and headed home, I felt a lightness in my step that had been absent for decades. The ring on my finger, Robert's ring, which I now wore on my right hand rather than my left, caught the last rays of the setting sun, sending a flash of light dancing across the sidewalk. That night, I dreamed of the creek, of sunlight on water, of fish jumping and children laughing. I dreamed of Robert as he had been when we were young, standing on the bank with a fishing pole, smiling at me with that smile that had once made my heart skip a beat. But in the dream, he didn't speak to me. He just nodded, as if in approval, then turned and walked away, growing fainter and fainter until he disappeared into the trees. I woke with tears on my cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of release, of letting go, of moving forward at last. The transformation that had begun in Robert's trailer, that moment when I'd taken his hand and said, "I forgive you," was continuing, evolving, reshaping me into someone new. Or perhaps not new exactly, but reclaimed. The Eliza May I might have been all along, if hurt and pride hadn't gotten in the way. At church that Sunday, I found myself volunteering to help with the Thanksgiving food drive, something I'd avoided for years, not wanting to spend more time than necessary in social situations. As I packed canned goods into boxes alongside women I'd known for decades, but kept at arm's length, I felt a sense of belonging that had eluded me for most of my adult life. "You know, Eliza," said Martha Thibodeau as we worked, "you've changed these past few months. In a good way," she added hastily. "You seem happier, more at peace." I considered this as I placed a can of green beans in a box. "I think I am," I said slowly. "I think I finally laid some old ghosts to rest." She nodded, understanding without needing the details. In a town like Oaksville, everyone knew everyone else's stories, or thought they did. But the true story of me and Robert, the pain, the forgiveness, the healing, was something only we had shared. And now that he was gone, it was mine alone to carry forward. That evening, as I sat on my small balcony watching the sun set over Oaksville, I thought about the journey of the past few months, from the moment Mary Louise had told me Robert was back, to the confrontation in his trailer, to the unexpected peace we'd found together at the end. "You were right, Robert," I said softly to the deepening twilight. "Love is all that matters in the end. Everything else is just noise." The diamond on my finger caught the last light of day, sending a prism of colors across the railing, not a symbol of what might have been, but of what was. A life coming full circle, wounds finally healing, a heart learning to open again after so long closed. 50 years was a long time to carry anger and hurt, but it was never too late for forgiveness, for growth, for transformation. I had learned that in Robert's final days, and it was perhaps the most valuable lesson of my life. As darkness fell over Oaksville, I made a silent promise to myself. Whatever time I had left, whether years or months or days, I would live it fully, openly, with a heart unburdened by old pain. I would be the Eliza May Walker I was always meant to be. And somewhere, I like to think, Robert Mitchell was smiling. It's been 5 years since Robert Mitchell passed away. 5 years since I stood at his graveside in the First Baptist Church Cemetery, watching as they lowered his casket into the Louisiana soil where both of us had been born, where one of us had remained all her life, and where the other had finally returned to find peace. 5 years isn't long compared to the 50 I spent carrying that hurt, but it's been long enough for me to understand what really happened in those final days we spent together. It wasn't just that I forgave Robert, though I did, truly and completely. It was that I finally forgave myself, for being blind to the signs that might have warned me, for letting one man's actions define so much of my life, for the walls I built that kept others out, but also kept me imprisoned within. James Beaumont and I have been keeping company these past few years. We're not romantic. We're too old for that kind of nonsense, we both say, but we're companions. We fish together at the cabin Robert left me, take drives to the coast now and then, go to church together on Sundays. His grandchildren call me Miss Eliza, and I bake them cookies when they visit. It's a gentle friendship, comfortable like a well-worn pair of slippers, and it fills a space in my life I hadn't realized was empty. The store is Jenny's now. I signed it over to her on my 80th birthday last year. She'd been running it practically on her own anyway, and I figured it was time. I still drop by most days to say hello, to visit with the customers who've been coming to Walker's General Store for decades. They seem glad to see me, and I'm glad to see them. The walls I built around myself for so long have finally come down, brick by brick, allowing people in at last. Last month, Ruth Ann organized a birthday party for me, my 81st. I tried to tell her not to fuss, but she insisted. "It's not every day someone turns 81, she said, though of course people turn 81 every day all over the world. What she meant was that not everyone gets to celebrate reaching such an age with friends and family and some measure of peace. The party was held in the fellowship hall at Second Baptist, where I still sing in the choir, despite my voice not being what it once was. Nearly half the town came. People I'd known all my life, children of people I'd known, even grandchildren. As I looked around at all those faces, I realized something profound. For most of these people, I was no longer defined by what had happened that day in 1974. I was just Miss Eliza, the former owner of Walker's General Store, a pillar of the community, a friend, a neighbor, a surrogate grandmother to some. The jilted bride was ancient history, as forgotten as last year's gossip. When I wore Robert's locket to the party, Ruth Ann raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She understands, I think, better than anyone could, what it represents. Not a lingering attachment to Robert himself, but a symbol of my own journey, of learning, finally, after all these years, to accept the past without letting it define my present or my future. The ring Robert left me stays in its box most days. I take it out sometimes, let the diamond catch the light, remember what it felt like to be young and full of dreams. But I don't wear it anymore. That chapter is closed, the story complete. The locket is enough, a small reminder that I was loved, imperfectly but truly, by a flawed man who carried his own burdens, made his own mistakes, found his own measure of redemption in the end. Sometimes I drive out to the cemetery, park my car under the shade of the old oak trees, and walk the gentle slope to Robert's grave. I don't bring flowers, Robert never was much for them, but I talk to him a bit, tell him what's been happening in Oaksville, how the town is changing, but somehow staying the same. Whether he can hear me or not doesn't much matter. It's a ritual that brings me comfort, a way of honoring not just what might have been, but what was. A love that, for all its tragic beginning, found a kind of peaceful end. Last spring, I made a decision I never thought I'd make. I transferred my church membership back to First Baptist. The young pastor there, Pastor Williams, a kind man with a young family, welcomed me warmly. "We're honored to have you, Miss Eliza," he said, as if I were doing them a favor instead of the other way around. That first Sunday back, I sat in a pew near the front, not hiding, not avoiding anyone's gaze. The church looked different than I remembered. New carpet, new paint, new faces in the congregation. But the bones were the same. The old wooden beams overhead, the stained glass windows casting colored light across the aisle, the worn pulpit where generations of preachers had delivered their sermons. As the organ played the opening hymn, I found myself thinking not of that long-ago day when I'd waited in vain for a groom who never came, but of all the other days in this church. My baptism, my parents' funeral services, Robert's service, the countless Sundays in between. This building had witnessed so much of my life, both the joys and the sorrows. It seemed fitting somehow that I should come home to it now, in my final years. Because that's what it felt like, coming home. Not to the site of my greatest humiliation, but to a place of peace, of acceptance, of community. The church had never been my enemy. It had just been a building, a witness to the drama of human lives, including mine. I sing in their choir now, too, alternating Sundays between First and Second Baptist. "You're double-dipping in grace," James teases me, but he understands. At our age, we take our blessings wherever we can find them. Ruth Ann says I'm making up for lost time, filling my days with more activity than I managed in the previous 30 years combined. Perhaps she's right. After spending so long closed off, guarded, I find I'm hungry for connection, for conversation, for the simple joy of shared experience. Last week, I had all my great-nieces over to the cabin for a baking day. We made peach cobbler, Robert's favorite, though I didn't tell them that. As I watched these young women, so full of life and possibility, I felt a strange, sweet sadness. Not regret exactly, but a recognition of paths not taken. I never had daughters of my own to teach these family recipes to. Never had the family Robert and I had once planned. But looking at those girls, Jenny's daughters and their cousins, I realized that family comes in many forms. They call me Aunt Eliza, though technically I'm their great-aunt. They come to me for advice, for comfort, for stories about the old days. They love me, and I love them. It's not the family I envisioned at 25, but it's family nonetheless. As we sat around the table that evening, eating cobbler still warm from the oven, the oldest girl, Sarah, asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Aunt Eliza, if you could go back and change one thing in your life, what would it be?" The others fell silent, perhaps embarrassed by such a personal question, but curious too. I considered it carefully as I took another bite of cobbler. "Nothing," I said finally, surprising myself as much as them. "Not a single thing." "But," Sarah hesitated, "what about what happened with Mr. Mitchell? Wouldn't you change that?" I smiled, understanding her confusion. In the simplified version of my story that had been passed down through the family, I was the wronged party, the innocent victim. Which was true, as far as it went. But life is rarely so simple. If Robert had shown up that day, I explained, my life would have been completely different. I might never have built the store into what it became, might never have discovered my own strength, my own capability. I might have been happy with him, or I might not have been. There's no way to know. I took a sip of my sweet tea before continuing. What I do know is this: the life I've lived, with all its disappointments, all its unexpected joys, has been mine. I built it with my own two hands, on my own terms. And I'm proud of that. The girls nodded, though I wasn't sure they fully understood. How could they? They were young, their lives still ahead of them, their hearts still whole and untested. They couldn't know yet how a single moment can alter the course of a life, how strength can be forged in the fire of heartbreak, how forgiveness can come even after 50 years of hurt. But someday they would know. Someday, if they were lucky enough to reach my age, they would understand that it's not the absence of pain that makes a life well lived, but what we choose to do with that pain, how we carry it, how we transform it, how we eventually, if we're wise, set it down and move forward unburdened. That's what Robert gave me in the end, though he certainly hadn't intended it all those years ago when he left that note with Pastor Mitchell. He gave me the chance to choose forgiveness, to reclaim the parts of myself I'd locked away, to find peace before it was too late. And in return, I gave him something too: the comfort of knowing he wasn't alone at the end, the relief of speaking his truth after 50 years of silence, the grace of forgiveness he hadn't earned but desperately needed. It wasn't the life we'd planned that spring day in 1974. It wasn't the future we'd envisioned when he slipped that ring on my finger at the church social. But maybe, in its own strange, roundabout way, it was the life we were meant to have after all. I still wear his locket every day, not as a symbol of what might have been, but of what was: a love interrupted, a life redirected, a heart that learned, finally, eventually, to open again. The diamond ring stays in its box, a beautiful reminder of youth and dreams and possibilities. But the locket lies against my skin, close to my heart, a tangible connection to the man who shaped my life in ways neither of us could have imagined. I don't know how much time I have left in this world. At 81, each day is a gift, each sunrise a blessing I don't take for granted. But however many days remain to me, I intend to live them fully, openly, with a heart finally unburdened by old pain. That's Robert's legacy, though he never knew it would be. Not the pain he caused, but the healing that eventually came. Not the love that was lost, but the forgiveness that was found. Not the life we didn't share, but the peace we both discovered, separately and together, at the end of our long, winding paths. And that, my friends, is the story of how I waited 50 years to forgive the man who left me at the altar, and in doing so, finally forgave myself. I've often wondered if any of you have experienced something similar in your own lives: a hurt that seemed impossible to heal, a wrong that seemed impossible to forgive, until something shifted and the impossible became possible after all. I'd love to hear your stories too. For now, I'll say goodbye from Oaksville, Louisiana, where the summers are still hot, the tea is still sweet, and second chances sometimes come when you least expect them. I'd love to know where all of you are listening from today. Drop a comment below and let me know what corner of the world you call home. Until next time, this is Eliza May Walker signing off. Remember, it's never too late for forgiveness, for growth, for transformation. Never too late to find peace, never too late to begin again.